Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third session, of our conference, whose title is Original Elements of the Aristotelian Model, Part 2. I have the pleasure to present Professor Elena Herrera, who is Associate Professor in Political Philosophy at the University of Bologna. In 25, she achieved a PhD in Ancient Political Philosophy in Durham University, UK. She has been lecturer in Ancient Philosophy and Modern and Contemporary Ethics at Warwick University. In the years 28-29, she has been Honorary Research Fellow in Ancient Philosophy at Durham University. She has been member of the research group Poetry and Philosophy in the Light of Plato, placed in Bergen University, and she is permanent member of the Collegium Politicum and of Seneca Institute for Classical Studies. She is author of books, various books on Aristotle, many articles on issues of ancient, modern, and contemporary political philosophy. She is currently working on issues of respect, toleration, solidarity in ancient, modern, and contemporary times. One of her last publications we can enjoy in volume 9 of the collection of the Collegium Politicum. The title of her paper is Eusebeia for the Gods as a Matter of Justice, Greek Popular Religion and Plato's Euthyphro, within the volume God, Religion and Society in Ancient Thought, from Early Greek Philosophy to Augustine, edited by Giovanni Giorgini and Elena Herrera herself. Many thanks, Elena, for staying here with us. I give you the floor. So you can speak us about Aristotle's Ta Politica as a Politicetis Methodos, an exploration of some of its normative and metaethical components.
Okay, thank you very much, Michele, for this very generous introduction, and I would also like to thank all the organizers of this conference for their excellent work. Today I would like to consider the first part of a paper which is still in progress, and the paper is on the metaethical components of the politics, and to do so I would like to concentrate more on what the Nicomachean ethics has to say about politics. And as it is well known, many are the difficulties and the controversial issues revolving around the task of a correct interpretation of the substantive contents of the argumentative strategies, and also on the main goals of the text, which has come down to us under the title Ta Politica. In fact, the work at issue has elicited among modern and contemporary scholars a plethora of questions relative to its genesis and internal chronology, as well as to its inner compositions and its overall consistency. And today I'm not going to talk about issues of chronological or logical order, but I would like to give you some suggestions on how to interpret this. I would call it treatise, although we have to qualify the word treaty itself. I think that the politics can be understood as a sort of political theorizing in action. Here I am using a suggestion by Thornton Lockwood in his paper published in 2015 on book 2 of the Politics, and published in Aristotle, A Critical Guide. And I would also like to consider the possibility that the politics is a treaty in the sense that it is a work in progress. It is composed, as many scholars believe, of a series of lectures, of classes given by Aristotle. We don't know exactly whether these were edited by Aristotle himself or by his students. However, I would like to stress the possibility to consider the politics, or Ta Politica, the political issues, as a project which can be considered as in unity with the Nicomachean ethics. So I would like to suggest a unity of investigation between Aristotle's ethical works, in particular, as I will try to show today, the Nicomachean ethics and the politics. And this approach has been suggested, for instance, by Richard Bodeus in the political dimensions of Aristotle's ethics, although I will have to disagree with Bodeus in the sense that Bodeus believes that while the Nicomachean ethics is a sort of theoretical works on ethics, the politics might be interpreted as a sort of applied ethics. And actually, I don't agree with this approach. I believe that both the Nicomachean ethics and the politics are let's say, methodoi, forms of investigations which are in progress. Sometimes they might also have aporetic aspects, and they might explore a wide possibilities of issues like constitutions, as we have seen so far this morning, or themes that convey the idea that ta politica is a complex matter. So it's not necessarily homogeneous. We don't necessarily have to adopt an homogeneous framework for understanding all the political issues treated in the politics. And in so doing, I will follow the approach adopted by Arianna Fermani and Maurizio Migliori, which they call the multifocal approach. So the idea that ta politica might be said in a plurality of perspectives. Now, Nicomachean ethics and the politics, a unitary project of investigation. So I mentioned very briefly Bodeus, who believes that they are unitary. For very rich discussions on the unitary approach of investigation, I suggest, I remind you to Manuel Knoll. He published various articles in which he demonstrates that there is some unity within the politics itself and between the politics and the Nicomachean ethics. I would also like to consider one approach which is taken by Eugene Garver. Garver wrote a book called Confronting Aristotle's Ethics in 2006. And actually, I tend to adopt his approach in the sense that just like in the rhetoric, which of course is a techne, but it can also be regarded as a sort of theoretical investigation on persuasion, even the politics might have, respectively, an internal and an external goal. So as for the external goal, we know that the ethics is a form of reflection on the highest good, and the highest good is practicable. So it is something that has to be realized by citizens, especially by lawgivers, by people having an enomothethike phronesis, the so-called legislative phronesis, which Aristotle distinguishes from the sheer political philosophy, phronesis, dealing with inferior matters. So the nomothethike is the most architectonic form of political phronesis. And phronesis operates in view of a concrete good. But we might also identify an internal goal, both in the rhetorics and in the Nicomachean ethics and in the politics. And the internal goal might be an amelioration, a constant improvement of the theoretical reflection on the highest good and the way to attain it. So I think that both in the Nicomachean ethics and in the politics, we have normative aspects concerning, for instance, what citizens should do to develop virtue, how charges and offices should be distributed among citizens. These are normative, but there are also meta-normative elements. And these elements, in my opinion, have to do with what a student of political theory should study, independently of what he or she wants to do with this political theory. So there might be people who want to use politiche episteme to become good lawgivers. there might be people who would like simply to investigate political matters. And there might also be intellectuals like Plato, for instance, who would be regarded in possession of a specific form of knowledge and able to theorize constitutions without being actively involved in the process of the drafting of a real constitution. So here I am, my view is departing from the one of Bodeus, because Bodeus believes that both the Nicomachean Ethics and the politics are a unitary project, but the politics is simply for would-be lawgivers, and I don't agree. I think it's a sort of teaching manual which has to do with issues of political theory. And I would like to demonstrate that this sort of treaty, or let's call it a methodos, a politicae methodos, might enable, might train people to become good lawgivers and at the same time teachers of political theory itself. So this is my main goal. And in so doing, I will draw a distinction between e politicae episteme, which I take it as a science, and e politicae phronesis, which is a form of practical wisdom. And here I relate to Enrico Berti, who draws a distinction between practical wisdom and practical philosophy. Now, for Enrico Berti, the Nicomachean Ethics is a sort of methodos, which is political, politicetis. I will show you here. It's text number 1. Emenu methodos tuton effietai politicetis usa. So the investigation starting the Nicomachean Ethics is somehow political. But Enrico Berti is warning us, because he's showing that when we talk about politics, we might talk, first of all, in terms of phronesis. Second, he politicae might be regarded as a techne, as we said this morning, or even as a dynamis. But the occurrences I have quoted here, I haven't added the text. In my view, especially concerning e politicae dynamis, or e politicae considered as an expertise, revolve more on the practical effects of this expertise. So, for instance, at the very beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, we have e politicae as architectonicae, as the most architectonic form of expertise. This is at least how Christopher Rowe translates it. E politicae in terms of political expertise. This expertise has a coordinating role with reference to all the other technae, all the other methodoi, all the other sciences, which teleologically speaking are supposed to contribute to the realization of the highest good. So in my opinion, the very first mention of e politicae as expertise has more to do with the practical import of this, let's call it craft, although it's not productive just like other technae. It has a coordinating and architectonic role. And when we talk about e politicae phronesis differently, especially in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we are referring to a kind of intellectual virtue, which has to do with deliberation in matters concerning the good life in general. And as I said, Aristotle also talks about politicae phronesis, which he distinguishes into legislative phronesis and a kind of phronesis which might be used to issue in decrees, in psephizmata, rather than in nomoi proper. And even in that sense, politicae phronesis is practical. It is an intellectual virtue with a practical effect. But Enrico Berti also says that we should distinguish these forms of ways of talking about e politicae from practical philosophy proper. And in my view, even in the politics, what Aristotle is doing is mainly adopting an approach of practical philosophy. Although, as many scholars have argued, one of them is Curtis Johnson, who talks about, in Aristotle's theory of the state, he draws a distinction between first-order questions in the politics, which are very general and definitory, and then second-order questions, which, according to the author himself, would have to do with technical aspects, more specific knowledges that lawgivers and politicians should learn in order to become good and virtuous. Actually, I realize there is a distinction between various questions. So some are more general, and others are more descriptively treated. Others are more specific because they relate to specific regimes. But in my opinion, even when Aristotle is talking about specific regimes, he does so in order to provide a sort of, let's say, universal knowledge of specific contexts. So another goal of my presentation is to, at least to suggest, if not to demonstrate, let's put it this way, that the politics, as well as the ethics, but the politics in particular, is supposed to offer the sort of universal knowledge at the basis of a practical syllogism. The practical syllogism which Phronesis allows politicians and lawgivers to craft. So, as I said, I think we are dealing with a scientific approach. This scientific approach has, of course, a practical import and practical implications. But my idea is that the main topics that are treated in the politics, both in general terms and specific contexts, specific constitutions, are designed to supply lawgivers or political theorists with the needed preliminary knowledge, which should be integrated with empirical evidences in order to craft a practical syllogism. And in that case, then we can talk about practical phronesis. But as I said, in the politics, at least my opinion, my suggestion is that we should focus on the normative, of course, but also and especially on the theoretical aspects which every virtuous person in a practical sense needs to possess in order to perform virtuous actions on the basis of good choices and deliberations. Now, here I simply added some translations to text number 1. I generally follow Rowe's translation. I didn't accept Roger Crisp's translation. He says, our inquiry is a kind of political science. No, here I think that Aristotle is talking about a methodos which is something political. And a methodos is a sort of investigation which is not linear. In fact, both in the Nicomachean ethics and in the politics, we find many adverbs like palin. We have to go back to things we have already treated, things that Aristotle might have treated a long way before, or adverbs like typo, which means in broad outline, in general terms. But then, and this is another of the goals of my paper, unfortunately I will not dwell on this aspect for reasons of time, but I think that for Aristotle, especially in the politics, the methodos operates from very generic definitions, gradually moving towards specific tenets, as for instance in the case of Book 3 of the Politics, with reference to the ideas of the nature of citizenship, which is treated in order to give a sense of what a constitution is. Aristotle starts from the idea that we need to speak about constitutions, but constitutions are a sort of order of the city, and the city is a compound of citizens, so we need to know the nature of citizens. And Aristotle proceeds from a sort of generic introduction on citizenship, which should apply not only to democracies, but also to other forms of constitution. So it's very generic, and this is just to give an example. And he culminates in the conclusion that the citizen is the one who, in every constitution, in every regime, has the faculty to take part in political office and in the office of a judge, without necessarily focusing on specific institutional organs. So he has a sort of functional and very anatomic, so to speak, view of citizenship. But then that is a sort of springboard, so to speak, for a discussion of the virtue of the good citizen and the possibility of looking for an identification between the virtue of the good citizen and the virtue of the good man. This is just an example to show how unlinear but also progressive the discussion might be, connecting various concepts and adopting various argumentative strategies to develop these broad arguments. But I would like to go back to the Nicomachean ethics. Okay. Here I would like to consider something which is written in the Nicomachean ethics but might apply, in my opinion, to the politics. Aristotle says, if I manage to find the passage, which is in chapter book 10. Book 10, it's text number 4, book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. After talking about pleasure, after talking about issues like justice, friendship, virtue, happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics, then Aristotle says, well, then, if we have accorded adequate discussion in outline both to these subjects and to the excellences, and again to friendship and pleasure, should we suppose our program completely carried out? Or, as one says, when it is a question of practical projects, here the idea is proairesis, is the goal not to reflect on each set of things and to know about them, but rather to get on and do them, so that in the case of excellence too, it is not sufficient to know about it, but rather one must try actually to have and to use it, or whatever way it is that we become good. So the issue is proairesis. My idea is that the politics, as well as part of a unitary project with the Nicomachean Ethics, might be considered as a sort of proairesis. And proairesis is choice, is rational choice, is desired accompanied by reason. Sorry, I don't find here. No, I don't find it. Sorry, however, I will summarize. So basically, proairesis is a sort of practical project. I'm using Christopher Rowe's translation. Practical project which involves a motivational component, a desire, a rational desire to pursue issues that might lead citizens and lawgivers to become good. And this sort of proairesis might be interpreted in different ways. For instance, Carlo Natali, in his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, says, mentioning Aspasius and Obenk, that according to Aspasius and Obenk, proairesis is connected also etymologically to the idea of a choice between alternative ways of reaching the goal. And it was focused specifically on this aspect as constitutive of choice. Whereas other commentators, like the Anonymous and Joachim, on the other hand, so we have ancient and modern commentators, understand a choice as before other things. So, one possibility is to consider proairesis, and I will consider this option, proairesis as a sort of alternative way, a choice between alternative ways of reaching the goal of realizing the practical good in the field of education. And here the choice is between pure discourses and practical education. So text number 5. In the field of praxis, realization of the highest good can proceed either by pure theoretical knowledge or by putting the good into practice. So there is an alternative. But then we also have the choice between private and public education. Because in the remainder, the concluding sections of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle stresses the fact that there might be a private sort of teaching which might be more punctual, more efficient for specific cases, because there might be parents having a specific sort of care for their children. So individual education on the one hand might be a good choice. But on the other, public education seems to be a better alternative. First of all, because it is public and it is shared. And as Sarah Brody suggests in her commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics published in 2002, it might create equality of opportunities as well as friendship between young people who will be at the basis of future communities. And most importantly, unlike private education, nomothesia, which is public education through laws, involves coercion. So the coercive aspect might be a more efficient and useful way to produce education to virtue. And it might also replace imperfect private education. And finally, if performed according to virtue, it presupposes knowledge of universal principles. In this sense, I connect this aspect of Aristotle's theorization in the Nicomachean Ethics to the possibility that the politics itself as a whole contains universal principles. So it's a book about nomothesia, but it's mainly a book about one aspect of nomothesia, its theoretical and universal dimension. Here I also wanted to quote a passage from Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. After explaining that one might be reasonably supervised well by someone who, although lacking science, can use experience, Aristotle says, still, this presumably does not mean that at any rate, if someone does wish to acquire technical knowledge and the capacity to think reflectively about a subject, he should not proceed to the level of the universal and familiarize himself with that so far as is possible. For that, as we said, is the sphere of expert knowledge. And perhaps if someone wishes to make people better, so we have a practical goal, whether in large numbers or in small, by exercising supervision over them, he too should attempt to become an expert in legislation, if it's through laws that we'd become good. There should have been a Greek translation which disappeared. I don't know what happened. I'm so sorry about that. However, basically, I wanted to stress the fact that Aristotelian teaching on nomothesia is a more efficient educational tool than others. In particular, a more efficient one than the sophistic one. So another aspect of proairesis as a choice between options has to do with the possibility of creating an alternative to the sophistic teaching. What is the difference between the sophistic teaching and the teaching proposed by Aristotle? The sophistic teaching is made by people who offer knowledges without being able to practically act as politicians. So they might claim to teach political virtue, but actually they are not able to be good politicians. Secondly, as Aristotle says, they do not provide universal principles. And that is, in my opinion, the aspect is stressing in his own teaching. And in particular, he also says that the sophists, by imparting a given teaching, would never be able to grant the addressees of their teaching to become teachers in their own right. So while the sophists cannot teach political theory and make other people not only better, but also good teachers, Aristotle might suggest the possibility that his teaching in the politics is actually operating in view not only of the creation of good lawgivers and politicians, but also in view of the creation of potential teachers of political matters. And here we have the last text. So should we next inquire from what source or how one might become an expert in legislation? Or is it, if we follow the model of other kinds of expertise, from the expert in politics? After all, legislation seems, as we saw, to be a part of political expertise. Or is it evidently not the same for political as it is for other kinds of expertise or capacity? For in the others, those who pass on the relevant capacities and those who practice them are plainly the same individuals, as with doctors or painters. But when it comes to things political, it's the sophists who profess to teach. But no sophist is a practitioner, rather the practitioners are rather the politicians, who would seem to do what they do by means of some sort of natural ability and experience, rather than by means of thought, since they are not well known for writing or lecturing on these sort of things. Though it would presumably have been a finer thing than making speeches for the law courts or the assembly. Or again, for having made political experts of their own sons or others close to them. But it would have been reasonable for them to have done so, if they were capable of it. For not only is there no better legacy they could have left to their cities, but there is nothing they would rather choose than this ability to have for themselves, and so for those dearest to them. I conclude this discussion on the Nicomachean ethics, and I would like to conclude by talking about, well, it's a passage we have already mentioned many times this morning, which is the first section of Book 4 of the Politics, where the issue of politicae episteme, political science, is articulated. And what Aristotle says is that those who want to investigate ta politica should know, so there is a prescriptive aspect within a context within meta-ethical, because here the politics configures itself, at least in my opinion, as a sort of reflection on what is required of political science, and also what is required of those people who want to become good political theorists. So there is a normative aspect within a meta-ethical aspect. And Aristotle talks about the best constitutions in absolute, but also about the best constitutions for specific circumstances, what is most suitable for specific regimes, the ways also to preserve somehow regimes in order to avoid stasis. And these sort of knowledges are, in my view, theoretical, although there might be the basis for a project, which of course is practical. I don't know if I have one more minute, but I can stop here if you like. Okay. If I am assisted by my paper, I simply added some rules on how to read the Politics by Pierre Benck, La politique d'Aristote, unité, facture, éloge de la lecture sommaire. published in 1987. Basically, what the author is suggesting is to read the politics as a whole with no specific reference to distinctions of literary style. And also he proposes to avoid a method of reading which is premised on doctrinal assumptions. Like, for instance, this is the example he gives, Werner Jaeger, and the idea that there might be books that belong to a supposed Platonic period and other books that might belong to a subsequent so-called empirical period. So he suggests avoiding reconstructions and readings premised on this sort of doctrinal, let's say, assumptions, if not prejudice. And the second, I'm reading just the second rule. La deuxième règle nous fera rejeter aussi les remises en ordre logique des textes. Barker en donne un exemple, sans y rallier à propos de la politique. Exemple d'enchaînement interdit. Les livres 5 doivent être placés après les livres 16 parce qu'il faut finir de traiter des constitutions avant d'aborder les problèmes de leur corruption. So this is just an example of what has to be avoided. And I think I might conclude here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Herrera, for this interesting paper on politics as pro-irisis, as a rational choice. We have some minutes for the discussion. I don't know if something...
Yeah.
Professor Bossi, you are welcome.
Yeah.
The word thought in one of the last, I don't know what is the Greek word for thought. Talking about the sophists.
Okay, it was. I think it was Dianoia. Where it? Let me
I
check.
think it's 9 or something like that. Text.
It's unbelievable. All the Greek disappeared.
One more.
One more.
Yes.
Okay.
Of thought.
Thought.
They are not well known for writing.
Sorry. Which?
I thought in
Thought, means of thought. Okay. Do my means of thought natural ability rather by means of thought. I don't remember. It should be Dianoia. Oh no! It works. It didn't work before. Sorry. Okay. Let me check. Dianoia. Yeah, it was Dianoia. Empiria or Dianoia. Dianoia. Yeah, Dianoia. Yeah. You're right.
Professor Knoll?
Yeah, thank you, Elena. I'm a bit puzzled by your use of the term metaethical in your title. You know, analytic philosophy, we distinguish between normative ethics, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. And meta-ethics usually starts from the linguistic term, and when we say something is right or wrong, what do we mean? Are we referring to moral facts, or are we just expressing our feelings? So that seems a bit different to the way how you use the term.
Yeah, in fact, I was a bit perplexed at the very beginning when I chose the title, but I of course I have to make a premise on what I mean by metaethical. By metaethical, I mean a reflection on the nature of ethics, and in this sense, in the name of the unity, in virtue of the unity, the supposed unity between the ethics and the politics, also the nature of politics. And here I'm using metaethical as a discourse on the nature of the investigation. For instance, if you consider the first passage, Methodos Politicae, what is this investigation? It's a sort of political investigation. I take it as an example of metaethical approach. And also, I consider the idea of meta-ethics as what is not strictly prescriptive in practical terms, or at least in terms of concrete political action. So, for instance, as I said, there are passages in Book 3 of the Politics, which I had not the chance to mention, that have to do with what citizens are required to do. Citizens, in order to be good, are required to obey. Good rulers, in order to be good, are first required to know how to obey in the city in general. That is prescriptive and ethical. I take it as ethical. An example of meta-ethical might be the section number 1 of Book 4 of the Politics. What students of politics are supposed to know, what they should know. Actually, it uses the word, the verb they, in what they should know. So it's prescriptive, but it's a sort of prescription which concerns theoretical matters. Yeah.
Some more questions? Yes?
Thank you very much. I had a question about, I find it very interesting that you emphasize the sort of the teaching dimension that might underpin this writing. And so it brings to my mind the fact that there was, and it was already ongoing by that time, the debate on the technai and whether from 5th century Athens on. And one of the points of contention of those who criticized the technai was they don't have principles that can be taught and learned. And it's interesting if Aristotle really wants to put emphasis on the fact that there are principles that can be taught and learned. So it makes me wonder, this might be a basic question for someone who is an expert on Aristotle, I'm not. So it makes me wonder whether Aristotle wanted to armor his political science against that criticism, and yet he doesn't call it a techne. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. Actually, I'm not sure if I'm going to give the most appropriate answer, but I think that yes, Aristotle might want somehow to distinguish his own teaching from other kind of technai. In fact, he actually mentions technai with reference to apolitike, but as far as I know, he's not strictly writing apolitike techne. Maybe there might be some reference perhaps in the Magna Moralia, but as far into my knowledge, there is also reference to the capacity, to the dynamis, and to science, and to politicae methodos, but not specifically on techne. So in my opinion, it might have to do with the willingness to, if not to depart from techne, at least to offer the idea of a more architectonic form of expertise, not only in the sense of the apolitike understood in the practical sense, but also in the sense of apolitike as a sort of teaching the subject. So yeah, I think it might be a very good suggestion. Thank you.
Any more question? Yes, Professor Lanza.
Considering your invitation to read politics as a totum, as a unicum, would you agree with way of considering the books 4 to 6 a second part of the same movement, from universal to particular, book 3 you mentioned, and then from particular to a generalization of the empirical experience to the universal again? This is the way some medieval commentators read politics, no?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I actually believe that Aristotle wants to supply us not only with knowledge of the best constitution in general, but also with knowledge of specific constitutions. It might be, in my opinion, a way to become more and more and more specific, although approaching the issues in general terms. So not only in terms of the experience he had, but also in terms of political theorizing. we should not forget the fact that we also have constitutions, like constitutions of the Athenians, and that is not called by Aristotle an example of nomothesia or theorizing on nomothesia. So what is this sort of nomothesia? What is the kind of theorizing involved? So yes, at least in my opinion, I would consider Aristotle's treatment of constitutions as a broad spectrum of possibilities. We were talking this morning about the possibility of a method of exploring possibilities, and I am perfectly in line with your suggestion, Michele, what you said this morning. So yes, and I also think that there might be a progressive shrinking, up to the point that then, if we want to preserve the traditional order of the books, up to the point that in any case we need to consider the absolute normative paradigm, which is the best constitution in absolute. Thank you.
Some more questions? Well, so once again, many thanks, Elena, and thanks to the audience for the fruitful discussion.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now we have an online paper. Very well.
Yeah. No, he can speak anytime you want.
Yes. Good afternoon, Professor Atsistavrou. Can you hear me? Sorry, the microphone. No, I'm not able to share the microphone. No.
But your microphone seems to be off.
Yes, but I.
This is not a computer for the microphone.
Ah, it's not a computer. Yeah, sorry. Professor Atsistavrou, good afternoon. No. Good afternoon, Professor Atsistavrou. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
How do you do, Professor?
I am surviving, as they say.
We too.
I think you are flourishing.
Thank you so much for your time and your effort. I am going to present you to our audience. Professor Anthony Atsistavrou is a senior lecturer in legal and political philosophy at the University of Hull and director of the program on the ethics of expertise and professional ethics at the Institute of Applied Ethics of the same university. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Edinburgh. Previously, he taught at the universities of Edinburgh, Leeds, Patras, and Cyprus, and held a visiting fellowship at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge. He was recently awarded a visiting fellowship at the Seeger Center for Hellenic Studies at Princeton University. Among his last publications, I would like to mention the paper Plato and the Utopia Within Us in the collection Utopias in Ancient Thought, edited by Pierre Destree, Jan Opsomer, and Gert Roskam, a volume published by De Gruyter in the year 2021. And today, Professor Atsistavrou is going to talk about political analysis and dialectic in Aristotle's Politics. Professor, you are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for accommodating me online, and apologies for any inconvenience that this might have caused, this arrangement. I have prepared a handout, and I'm going to make references to the handout throughout my talk. It contains 3 passages from the Politics. I hope that the participants have it available so that because I will be making constant references to it. Well, let me start by trying to offer a kind of general overview of the paper. Um, it, it started as follows: my interest in the subject, my interest in the issue of the role of dialectic in Aristotle's politics. Um, I I had sent a paper to a journal, Apiron, that eventually got published, and one of the referees made a comment that struck me as quite insightful. The comment was that there hasn't been a lot of discussion about the role of dialectic in Aristotle's politics, and I thought that was a very insightful point. I started thinking about doing something about the role of dialectic in Aristotle's politics. I didn't make much of a headway until I read an article by Gabriella Rossi in Oxford Studies on Ancient Philosophy. It was published in 2017. The title is Going Through Aporia, Going Through the Puzzles. And there, Gabriella Rossi, what I think is an excellent paper, makes a very convincing case that, at least insofar as the metaphysics and the physics are concerned, when Aristotle uses the term resolution and he focuses on the revolution of different puzzles, he is not providing the resolutions do not consist in refutations of opposing theses. If there were really refutations, then the arguments involved would vindicate at least one of the opposing positions. But what Aristotle is primarily doing with resolutions in metaphysics and physics is he's trying to identify flaws in arguments. He examines different arguments and tries to identify flaws in those arguments. So he provides a kind of critical analysis of arguments, and essentially what a resolution actually provides is it exposes the reason why a false argument is false. And this is a kind of definition that Aristotle provides, a definition of the resolution of an argument that Aristotle provides in the sophistical refutations. So what I got interested in trying to ascertain is whether Aristotle is actually using resolution and he understands puzzles in the politics in a similar manner. Namely, the idea would be that the resolution of a puzzle does not aim at refuting a particular position and possibly vindicating another, but rather as providing critical analysis of arguments and identify specific flaws, errors of logical inference, falsity of premises, that one or both of the conflicting arguments that generate the puzzle might involve. And there are a lot of puzzles that we find in the politics. There are puzzles about the definition of citizenship, the criteria of identification of city-states, the relationship between the standards of being a good citizen and being a good man, or the definitions of democracy and oligarchy. And because I was already involved in some research about the 311, Aristotle's arguments in Politics 311, I thought of focusing on the resolution of puzzles concerning the political authority of the many in 311. And there we find primarily four puzzles. The first one revolves around the question of whether the multitude or the few best men should have authority. The second concerns the question over what the free or the multitude of the citizens understood as those who are neither wealthy nor have any claim whatsoever to virtue should have authority. And in the resolution of that second puzzle, in 311, Aristotle mentions the possibility of the Solonian constitution that gives the many the authority to inspect and elect officials, though no power to decide on policy. And then he examines and proposes two further resolutions to two puzzles about the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution. And this is what I would like to focus upon in my talk today. Before analyzing the arguments of 311, of Politics 311, I would like to provide an initial justification for thinking that Aristotle is a bit skeptical at providing a kind of merit-based justification of the authority of the many in Politics 311. The idea that he is providing a kind of merit-based justification of the authority of the many, that is a justification that is in accordance with his principle of distributive justice, has a lot of purchase, is quite popular in contemporary scholarship. And a lot of scholars, Robinson in his commentary on the Politics, claims that Aristotle aims at justifying democracy. Cate, also David Cate, he considers the arguments of 311 as a defense of democracy. Waldron speaks of the argument of the doctrine of the wisdom of the multitude as an argument for democracy. Melissa Lane takes the arguments of 311 to be arguments for democratic judgment and the value of democratic judgment, and she takes Aristotle to support a kind of Schumpeterian type of democracy. So one of the main things that, one of the implications of the thesis that Aristotle's arguments, Aristotle's resolutions of puzzles in 311 are critical analysis of arguments and do not aim to vindicate the authority of the many, is that this particular democratic reading of those arguments, namely the idea that Aristotle provides a kind of merit-based justification of the authority of the many in 311, needs to be revisited. And let me first adduce some evidence why I think that the arguments of 311 might fail. Aristotle might think that the arguments of 311 fail to provide a merit-based justification for the authority of the many. And the relevant text is in P3 in your handout. I'm not going to read P3. I'm just making some comments about it. First, I have divided P3 in different sections, A to F, and I will make references to these sections as I am reading my paper. So, two initial comments about P3. First, though in section A, the puzzle that is the focus of P3 is described as a puzzle about political honors, references to claims to authority in sections D and E suggest that the subject of the puzzle is the same as the subjects of the generic puzzle about who should have authority in the city that was introduced in 310. The puzzles about the authority of the men in 311 are part of that generic puzzle. So section F, which contains the conclusion of P3, may reasonably consider to state the conclusion of Aristotle's discussion of the puzzles relating to legitimate political authority that were examined in chapters 10 to 13 of Book 3. Second general clarification, Newman in his commentary finds Aristotle's conclusion unconvincing, the conclusion which is stated in F. According to him, it does not follow that a claim is bad because it does not hold under all circumstances. I think, however, that what Aristotle is getting at here is that all the standards that are discussed in sections B to E of P3 are in a sense self-defeating. And as such, they cannot be valid merit basis for a claim to rule. What seems to play a crucial role in the relevant arguments is the implicit understanding of the standards that are discussed in sections B to D as what we might call threshold comparative concepts. Let me explain what I have in mind. In order for X to qualify as, let's say, rich X, X needs to have a certain amount of property. That is the relevant wealth threshold. But above that threshold, some people may be considered wealthier than others. Those who, like X, invoke wealth as a merit base for their claim to authority, and thus as a standard of a particular constitution, namely oligarchy, they have to acknowledge that because wealth is a threshold comparative concept, those who are individually or collectively wealthier, say an individual Y or a group G, may have superior merit base for the claim to authority and thus should rule over all others. The problem is not as such that X's claim to rule on the basis of wealth is defeated in those circumstances, but rather that wealth, which is the standard or defining mark, oros, of oligarchy, turns out to become the standard or defining mark of a different constitution, namely the rule of one person or a multitude. To put it differently, the standard of oligarchy is self-defeating because it can be used as the merit base for a claim to authority that defines a constitution different from oligarchy. And so I suggest that when in section F of P3, Aristotle characterizes standards as not being correct, he means that they are not correct qua standards of the constitutions they purport to define, and thus they do not provide valid, that is, not self-defeating, merit basis for relevant claims to authority. Self-defeating standards cannot justify constitutions or claims to authority. Aristotle appears to identify two standards that may define a constitution ruled by a multitude. In section C of P3, he focused on the standard of freedom, that is the paradigmatic standard of democracy. Given the close link between freedom and good breeding, eugenia, the relevant standard may be also understood to be a threshold comparative concept and thus to be self-defeating in the same way in which the standard of wealth is. That is, it may be used as the merit base for a claim to authority that defines a constitution different from democracy. For example, the rule of few or the rule of only one individual. Thus, since it is self-defeating, it cannot provide justification for constitutions or related claims to authority. In section E of P3, nevertheless, a different standard is identified, which relates closely to the arguments of 311 and paradigmatically characterizes a multitude qua multitude. That standard is collective superiority. In section E of P3, Aristotle does not specify in what the members of a multitude are collectively superior, but the arguments of 311 provide an answer. They are superior in one of the standards that are normally invoked by the elitist opponents of the many, namely either wealth or virtue. In that respect, collective superiority may be considered a second-order standard. But since the relevant first-order standards are self-defeating, namely wealth and virtue, in the sense that I have explained, collective superiority in one of those first-order standards may equally fail to provide a multitude with a valid, that is, a not self-defeating merit base for a claim to authority. A particular individual or a small group of individuals may turn out to be wealthier or more virtuous than the members of a multitude collectively. Thus, collective superiority in wealth or virtue also fails to be correct qua standard of the Constitution that it purports to define, namely the rule of a multitude. Now, there are some problems with understanding section D of P3 in your handout. Virtue there is identified as a self-defeating standard. In a section of the paper, which I'm not going to read, I'm arguing that here Aristotle doesn't have in mind complete virtue, that is the standard of true aristocracy, but rather some kind of partial virtue, like the virtue that you find in some type of so-called aristocracies and even in polities. and it is possibly to have collective superiority in that particular kind of virtue, and that's how the argument proceeds. So if my interpretation of P3 is correct, then Aristotle's dialectical aim in 311 cannot be to establish that the many have merit-based justified authority in line with his principle of distributive justice. For in P3, he suggests that all standards of constitutions, including collective superiority as a second-order standard, fail to provide merit-based justification for political authority. So how then, if that is the case, should we understand the dialectical aim of the arguments of 311? Before analyzing or providing rather an outline of the dialectical aim of the arguments of 311, according in line with Rossi's interpretation of resolutions in Aristotle, the use of resolutions in Aristotle, I would like to briefly discuss a distinction between two different criteria of political legitimacy that Aristotle implicitly draws and that they play a crucial role in the puzzles in Politics 311. The first criterion of political legitimacy is the merit criterion. The merit criterion is introduced in 3.9 of the Politics in the context of an initial assessment of the arguments for the justification of the authority of the poor and the wealthy that are based on the standards of freedom and wealth, respectively. In Politics 3.12 and 13, the standards of good birth and virtue are also considered as relevant merit bases. On the merit criterion, the authority of a class of people is justified because that class merits it on the basis of some standard, wealth, freedom, good birth, etc., that its members individually or collectively possess, and is also the defining mark of a certain constitution. The value of each standard is assessed on the basis of whether it's a constitutive part of the city-state. Constitutive parts of a city-state include elements that are necessary for either the existence or the good governance of the city. In Politics 3.10, however, when Aristotle introduces the generic puzzle about who should be in authority in a city, a different criterion of political legitimacy emerges and becomes the focus of the discussion. In 3.10, he mentions, without attempting to resolve, a series of puzzles, which are parts of the generic puzzle about political authority, that concern the authority of each one of the 5 main claimants of legitimate power: the multitude, the wealthy, the decent, the best individual, and the tyrant. Those puzzles are generated, at least in part, by considerations about the justice of a specific set of the political consequences of ascribing authority to each one of those claimants, and not exclusively by considerations about the merit base of their claims to rule. More specifically, Aristotle presents the poor and the wealthy to share a common principle of justice that defines the exercise of their power, according to which whatever appears to be just to those in authority is just. He argues that that principle has catastrophic political consequences. It is used by the poor and the wealthy in order to justify the confiscation of property of their class opponents and thus destroy the city. Since it destroys the city, that principle cannot be a principle of justice, because justice does not destroy the city. He also indicates that tyrants rely on the same principle of justice, and thus their rule is equally catastrophic for the city and thus unjust. In his brief examination of the arguments for the authority of the decent and the best man, Aristotle identifies a similar problem. A significant political consequence of ascribing authority to the decent or the best man is that the vast majority of the people are left without having any office, and thus any political honors. The reason why this empowerment of the many may destroy the city is presumably that a city in which the vast majority of people lack any form of political power is likely to be internally unstable, and thus susceptible to civil strife. Aristotle's point is that it may be unjust for any one of those claimants to have authority because their rule threatens to destroy the internal stability of the city. That consideration is markedly different from the type of considerations involved in assessing the value of the merit base for example, wealth of freedom, of a related claim to authority, namely its contribution to the existence and management of the city. So in Politics 3.10, Aristotle treats the preservation of internal political stability as a criterion of political legitimacy that is distinct from the merit criterion. Now, with this distinction in mind, let us look at the resolutions of the puzzles in 3.11. What are the conflicting arguments that generate the first puzzle, which is described in P1 in your handout? Since in P1 the claims to authority of the multitude and the few best men are contrasted, we should look for arguments in support of the claims of each one of the claimants. It is plausible to assume that the argument in favor of the claim of the few best men is the one already mentioned in 3.9, namely that the best men contribute more than anyone else and thus than the multitude to the proper end of the city which is living well. That is an argument that employs the merit criterion of political legitimacy. It is not clear what argument in support of the authority of the multitude Aristotle has in mind in P1. It could be the merit-based argument about the value of freedom that he mentions earlier, or the argument about the resentment of that the many may feel in a regime in which all political honors go to the best men, as per 3.10. And that argument employs the internal stability criterion of political legitimacy. Or possibly he has in mind a combination of both arguments. How does he think that P1 is resolved, the first puzzle that he described in P1 is resolved? Aristotle's point, and here I will not go in all the details of the argument, but I will focus on the main point. Aristotle's point may be understood to be that the argument in favor of the authority of the few best men suffers from a particular type of flaw. It unreasonably discounts the possibility that some multitude enjoys collective superiority in political virtue and the ability to make decisions on a wide range of policies, provided that the political abilities of its individual members satisfy a certain threshold. The members of that multitude are not beast-like. That resolution prepares the ground for the acknowledgement in P3 of your handout that the standard of virtue, partial virtue according to my understanding, as all the other standards used in arguments in favor of the political authority of different groups of people, is self-defeating. What conflicting arguments generate the second puzzle, which is described in P2 of your handout? The first of the conflicting arguments of P2 is the argument put forward by opponents of democracy, presumably oligarchs and aristocrats, that it is not safe that the poor have authority in the city in the sense of sharing in the highest offices because they are bound to make unjust and politically harmful decisions. It is plausible to read here a reference to the potential catastrophic consequences of democracy that are outlined in 3.10, namely that it may threaten the internal stability of the city, since the Democrats will try to confiscate the property of their class opponents. In the second puzzle, that argument is considered to conflict with another argument already mentioned in 3.10, namely that giving no political power to the majority of citizens risks civil strife. So the second puzzle results from the conflict between arguments for and against democracy that are based on the internal stability criterion of political legitimacy. Now, what about the resolution of the second puzzle? Now, the resolution of the second puzzle appears to identify two errors of reasoning. The first is shared by both critics and supporters of democracy. They fail to appreciate that there is a viable middle way, namely preventing any numbers of the many from holding offices that make policy decisions while allowing the many to elect and inspect officials. That is the constitution that Solon and other legislators favored precisely for the reason that it reduces the risk of functional conflict. So the main argument in support of the Solonian constitution employs the internal stability criterion. The second error is an error committed by critics of democracy and is similar to the error identified in the resolution of the first puzzle. The many may be collectively competent enough at making decisions of a narrow scope. namely decisions concerning the election and inspection of officials. Identification of the first error, namely the failure to consider the possibility of the Solonian constitution, paves the way for the next two puzzles in Politics 311, the resolutions of which directly support the conclusion of text P3 in your handout about the self-defeating character of the standards of virtue and wealth. Identification of the second error supports the self-defeating character of the standard of virtue, partial virtue in the city, as analyzed in P3 in your handout. The second and the third puzzles in 311 are generated by the conflict between the main argument for the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution that relies on the internal stability criterion and certain arguments that challenge the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution on grounds of merit. More specifically, in the third puzzle, the argument against the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution is based on the claim of the knowledgeable or the educated in politics that they deserve to elect and inspect officials. Excuse me, on the basis of their superior knowledge. In the fourth puzzle, the argument against the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution is based on the claim of the wealthy that they deserve to have greater authority than the poor because of their superior wealth. So the third and the fourth puzzle can be understood as dealing with the question of whether a multitude's potential lack of relevant political merit outweighs or even cancels the potential benefit of reducing the risk of internal strife that the Solonian constitution brings. In the third puzzle, the challenge to the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution takes the form of the following argument. In areas like medicine, in which decisions are based on experience or craft knowledge, the knowledgeable, or at least those who are educated in the relevant areas, are qualified to judge who has performed well in those areas. It is the doctor, for example, who is qualified to judge whether a particular practitioner of medicine has successfully cured a patient. And the relevant experts are qualified to choose, are at least more qualified to choose than any non-experts, another expert among themselves for a certain task. For example, the geometers are qualified to choose a geometer for a certain survey, and the captains are qualified to choose a captain for a certain trip. So by this line of reasoning, the many should not have the authority to elect and inspect officials, but presumably only those who are knowledgeable or at least educated in politics should have the relevant merit-based claim. The resolution of the third puzzle combines two arguments. The first argument, which Aristotle calls the previous argument, is the argument that we have already found in the resolution of the first puzzle. So the opponents of the Solonian constitution, like the supporters of the rule of the best men in the first puzzle, unduly discount the possibility of the collective superiority of the many in some area of political decision making. The second argument identifies a different error. According to it, the critics of the Solonian constitution unduly discount the possibility that for at least some crafts, the non-expert users are better than the craftsmen in assessing the value of the products of those crafts, and that politics might be such a craft. The gist of the second argument is that each individual user, and not only a group of users collectively, is better at judging the product of a craft than any relevant individual expert. In that respect, the second argument conflicts with a basic premise of the first argument of the resolution of the third puzzle, namely that individual non-experts are inferior judges to the experts. That inconsistency is, I think, an additional reason for doubting that in 311, Aristotle aims at justifying the authority of the many. If Aristotle were understood to try to justify why the many have a valid merit-based claim to elect and inspect officials, one could plausibly retort that his arguments cancel one another. By contrast, if Aristotle aims only at a critical analysis of the arguments of some opponents of the rule of the many, the inconsistency between those two arguments is not disconcerting. Aristotle need only be understood to aim at identifying holes in the argument of the opponents of the Solonian constitution and show different ways in which they have failed to establish their case. The fourth puzzle in 311 is generated by the conflict between the argument for the legitimacy of the Solonian constitution that relies on the internal stability criterion and the argument that it is absurd to hold that the base, rather than the decent, have authority over issues of the greatest political significance, like the election and inspection of officials. The context of the argument makes clear that the many are called base because they are poor, while the decent are the wealthy few. The precise reason why ascribing to the poor the power to elect and inspect officials is absurd is not clear, as Aristotle's formulation of the objection of the wealth elitist here is very condensed. It could simply be that in their eyes, giving the poor significant political power is comprehensible, or it might relate to what they perceive as an internal contradiction in the Solonian constitution. Since in it the wealthy have the exclusive privilege of holding some of the highest offices, like the office of a treasurer or a general, why can they also not have the exclusive privilege of electing and inspecting officials? Aristotle's proposed resolution of the fourth puzzle runs as follows. Since according to the Solonian constitution, power belongs to collective entities like the court and the people, and not to individual members of those entities, it is just, and here I quote from the politics, it is just that the multitude has authority, for the people and the council and the courts consist of many individuals. Subsequently, the property assessment, timima, of all of them is greater than the property assessment of either each one of those who hold the highest offices taken singly or a small group of those. End of quote. So, according to the resolution of the fourth puzzle, the argument of the wealth elitists suffers from the same error as similar arguments in the other three puzzles, namely, it unduly discounts the possibility of the many's collective superiority in the standard that the elitists use as the merit base for their claim to rule. In the fourth puzzle, the relevant standard is wealth. So the fourth puzzle prepares the ground for the conclusion of P3 in your handout, that the standard that the wealth elitists use to support their claim to authority is self-defeating and can be used to define the rule of a multitude. It is thus possible, and I conclude, to understand the arguments of 311 as critical analysis of puzzles about the authority of the many, that do not aim at vindicating their authority, but at showing a common error in the arguments of virtue and wealth elitists. As it is explained in P3, that error shows that virtue, understood as partial virtue, and wealth are self-defeating standards, and thus not valid merit basis for the claim to rule. But since P3 also shows that collective superiority in those standards is equally self-defeating, it is hard to see how a merit-based justification for the authority of the many may be deduced from the arguments of 311. So I think that the alternative reading based on Rossi's account of the role and the function of resolutions in Aristotle is a more promising way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Hatzistavru, for this paper clarifying some passages of Book 3 of Politics. We have some minutes for discussion. If, of course, if you are available, Professor. I don't know if something.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. If someone likes ask something. Yes, Professor Bossi. Beatrice, would you like to come close, please, so Anthony can not only hear but also see you? No. Here. Because his camera is very limited.
Okay, thank you very much for your paper. I'm interested in the Platonic connection with the Protagoras and other
text by Plato, where he focuses on non-experts. So would you like to explore that a bit? I agree with your analysis, and I find that the two criteria which I could capture from your paper, the stability of the city and the knowledge are important points that against the democratical views. So would you like to explore that in Plato, or perhaps don't know?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, can you just clarify? You refer to the Protagoras. You mean the great speech, the arguments that Protagoras put forward that sometimes have been thought of as arguments in favor of democracy?
Yeah, these are things that are in the street. So you have the Disoi logo and the Protagoras great speech, as you say, saying that the many have the right to interview in the assembly, and they have the right to, against the Socratical view that virtue is just one and it cannot be taught, and it is, well, Socrates does not offer arguments, but he just focuses on what is happening in the city. Apparently, even the Athenians, who are wise, do not think this can be taught, because anyone can participate in the assembly and they don't need any expert knowledge at all. And so this is something that belongs to the common debate at that time. So I wonder if you wanted to explore a bit more this connection between Plato and Aristotle on the criticisms of giving the authority to the many if they have no expert knowledge. That's my...
Yes, thank you. Yes, that is quite useful. Thank you for that. I will obviously have to go back and read the great speech carefully in order to see whether there are any specific parallels with the kind of arguments that we find in 311. The arguments of 311 seem to suggest that you can have a kind of collective superiority in political decision making. The way I have analyzed that is not in this talk, but somewhere else, is that this seems to bring together some kind of experience that the many have, as opposed to some kind of knowledge or expertise. Here, there are different ways in which this has been analyzed. Some obviously argue for a kind of deliberative model of bringing together, of adding the relevant experience or for some knowledge that the many have. Others argue for more an aggregative picture, that the experience or the knowledge is aggregated. I have to look carefully at the Protagoras to see if there is a specific model there. I mean, Protagoras uses this notion that there can be specialized expertise, but on some issues like virtue, like in issues of language, you have either everybody is a kind of expert, or everybody has some kind of equal competence. In order to clarify whether we can have a specific parallel with Aristotle's argument, or it is an altogether different type of defense or potential defense of democracy. So, I mean, thank you for that. That is quite useful for me to look at. If I may add one more thing about the distinction between merit-based and internal stability criterion that might relate to your question, though does not directly concern the Protagoras. we have, especially in the laws, a kind of great interest that Plato shows, especially in the genealogy in Book 3 of the laws, in the genealogy of law as an institution. A lot of emphasis on standards of internal stability. And according to one argument which I have developed elsewhere, I think that here we can see Plato operating with a conception of the authority of law as based in something like being able to keep society together without necessarily promoting justice or virtue in a kind of full-blooded way, like anything like the virtue understood as a structure that represents the primacy of wisdom over the other cardinal virtues. If that is the case, then we can drop a potential parallel between Aristotle's interest in issues of internal stability, and more specifically in making internal stability a criterion of political legitimacy, and Plato's interest in the laws in making some kind of political stability a kind of condition of the legitimacy of law. And I think that is quite interesting parallel. And given how late the laws are, it is more likely to think that there might even have been a kind of influence or some kind of exchange between Plato and Aristotle, or some exchange of ideas about those issues. So that is something, yeah.
May I say something? Or?
Yes, of course.
Well, I wonder how this stability criterium can be sustained without virtue. I mean, in the Republic, as you know well, moderation is the agreement about who has to govern, who has to obey, and without virtue, I find it difficult to establish this stability. I mean, stability, the laws as producing stability has to, in Plato's view, I think, and maybe Aristotle agrees, has to be based on virtue somehow. I wonder how. I think these are not independent criteria, in my view, according to Plato, at least.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for that. I have argued in a paper on Plato's legal positivism that Plato actually draws this distinction. He has a criterion of legitimacy of law which is independent of full virtue. And the main evidence for that is what he claims in Book 3, that certain polities, certain constitutions, like Crete and Sparta, and also the Persian Empire under different rulers, were actually proper constitutions, and their laws were correct laws. So this seems to indicate that he operates with a kind of lower standard of law, if you like, or the lower standard of the legitimacy of law, that does not presuppose the existence of full virtue in the city, or even that the aim of the Constitution is the kind of structure, virtue as a structure, that involves the primacy of wisdom and a particular structure of all the other cardinal virtues, like the one that we find in Magnesia. And Plato is, in the laws, quite clear that he criticizes both Sparta and Crete for actually not following virtue in that sense. Nevertheless, he's willing to call those constitutions proper constitutions and their laws correct laws. So that is the main evidence for thinking that he differentiates the criterion for the legitimacy of law from virtue.
Well.
And that's why I think there might be a potential parallel. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your answer.
some more questions for Professor Atsistavru. I had a couple of short questions. The first about the translation, because I read in the handout that is the translation by Reeve, but some modifications. For example, in puzzle 3, in P3, in section F, yes, all these arguments then seem to make it evident that none of the standards in accord. Standards is your translation of the Greek word oros. I'm not so convinced that this is the best translation, because oros is, bueno, in general definition, and here criterion, because standard is the best criterion, but here Aristotle is rejecting the legitimacy of these definitions. And then the translation here is quite complicated, in accord with which people claim that they themselves claim to merit. In reality, Greek text is very easier, because this phrase, people claim that they themselves claim to merit, in Greek as axiousi autoi mein archein. They claim to merit Tural.
I have to check. It might be what I put on the handout. I might have made a mistake. I'll need to check that with Reeve, the second point.
Doesn't matter.
I can tell you about the standard.
It was a secondary question. On the contrary, I think it's very interesting your observation about the use of analogy in P1. And my question is, how do you explain the insertion, the use of analogies in order to clarify this, the arguments of the Aristotelian, with a little remark. In case number 3, where you put analogy 3, that is why the many judge better the works of music and the poets. Well, this is an interesting anticipation of a topic of book 8 about the capability to judge musical and artistic executions. But once again, I agree with you, underlining the importance of the analogy, because in case 1 and 2, the Greek text has oion in the first case and osper in the second. On the contrary, analogy 3, that is why the many judge, is dio kai. So, not an analogy, but a conclusion, the explanation, of an important motive. Which was your reason to list the detail of the analogies?
Yes, thank you. That is very useful. Thank you. Let me start with your second question about the analogy. I use the term analogy here in order to indicate that Plato treats as analogous the issue about the collective abilities of the many to decide on political issues with, in some cases, a feast, in other case, something like a person that has many parts, and in other case with judging not about political issues, but judging about poetic competitions. So he is using an analogy. He's trying to illustrate a point about the collective abilities of the many by using 3 different cases that he treats them as analogous to the collective, or as cases that can illustrate in different ways why the many collectively have certain capabilities. So that was how I was using the term analogy in that specific context. Now, concerning your other point about oros, oros is a very interesting term. I think that Aristotle links the standard or the defining mark of oros of a constitution and the principle of the distribution of political power that defines the merit base of relevant claims to rule in his account of aristocracy in Book 4, Chapter 8. And this is where, you know, one can see what exactly the precise link that Aristotle draws in that specific context is. So that is why I have again to check whether standard is my translation or it is Reeves' translation in that context. But when the fever resides, I'll probably remember what the situation, who has translated what. But in that specific, that was the rationale for the choice of the translation in that specific context. There is obviously a lot of discussion. Reeve has an interesting discussion about the use of oros in one of his books, and I think I have drawn on that in. I think it is in Action, Contemplation, and Happiness, and so my discussion here must be informed by that kind of analysis. But the basic point that is relevant here is that there is a link between oros as the defining mark of a constitution and the standard of the criterion of political legitimacy of the ruling class in that political constitution, which is made explicit by the use of oros in Chapter 8, Book 4 of the Politics.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Some question more? No? So we can close the session. Once again, many thanks, Professor, for your passion and effort.
Thank you very much for accommodating me.
See you
Thank
soon.
You very much.
See you soon.
And apologies again for the inconvenience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Questo devo usarlo con si sente.
Sì, sì, sì. Poi non so come si chiuda o si apra. Sono sempre aperti, mi sembra. Questo è tutto. Ah no, questo è l'ISO.
Io vi testo qua e basta.
Amici, sodales, filosofi peritissimi, quaeso convenite, omnes. Quod non possum latine, non licet, latine loqui. Aliud facere non possum quin anglice loquor. Well, good evening, quite good night to everybody. I ask you for the last effort with maybe more stoic than Aristotelian virtues of endurance and resistance for the last of our session of today. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in this session for two different reasons. The first reason is that, as you see, all the session is on political thought in the new Roman world. This means that Romans were also able to think, and that there is a Roman thought. This phrase, maybe 50 years ago, was a contradictio in terminis, in the sense that Romans were not able to think, but only to fight and to rule, maybe, but not to think. And the fact that we can now, today, think without problems of a Roman philosophy, and to have also an Oxford Handbook of Roman philosophy, is an evidence that times have changed in the last decades, and now it is possible also to face philosophically Roman texts. So the first reason was this one. The second reason of happiness is that all this panel is formed by former students of the University of Turin, so I'm particularly happy to be here with two of my former students, and it is not the case that it happens in Turin, because we have a long tradition of studies about Roman thought. I can only quote two important books. The first book is I Dossografi di Etica, the Dossographers of Ethics, by Michelangelo Giusta, a very important book, often never read about Forallem, particularly by Anglo-Saxon scholars. And secondly, La filosofia a Roma dalle origini all'impero by Giovanna Garbarino, 1973, an important recollection of all the quotations of philosophy in the Roman text, in the text of the Roman Republic. I quote this book only for personal reasons, because one paper of this book about philosophy in the political and in the historiographical works has been made, this paper, by me and by Elisa Della Calce. Elisa Della Calce, who is also editing a volume which will be very important about Livy and about the idea, the also philosophical and practical ideal of clemency in Livy. So I give her the floor. I will be the servant here for the PowerPoint, and for reasons of time, I think it will be better to have only one question time at the end of both of the second conference, so not as usual. Please, Elisa.
Many thanks for the introduction, and I would like to thank Michele Curnis and all the organizer of this conference. I'm very glad to be here and take part into this very rich and stimulating context. So let's focus now on Polybius. Only the first 5 books of Polybius's histories and part of the 6th have come down to us, whereas the other books survive in fragments and collections of excerpta. Polybius is not only an important historical source, especially according to Livy's words and Cicero's positive judgment, but is also presented by Cicero as peritissimus rerum civilium, along with Panetius. In the words of James Zetzel, both of them represent the two aspects of Republic itself, the combination of philosophy and Roman history. Moreover, Polybius collects lessons and precepts concerning politics. Despite his work being divided into different books, the political theory that emerges follows a thread which is essentially homogeneous and is also echoed in later Latin literature. This paper aims to highlight some aspects regarding a political theory in Polybius' histories and its intersections with Cicero's and especially Livy's thought. For this purpose, I will group them in two main areas. The model of leadership, in particular in ruling chaotic, unstable, and irrational masses, the way to gain the consent of the vanquished. In Book 6, Polybius describes both the different forms of government, kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, with their respective degenerations, tyranny, oligarchy, and ochlocracy, and Roman mixed constitution, which aims to achieve a certain political stability. However, regardless of this well-known presentation, Polybius sometimes interrupts the narrative historical flow in order to insert some political ideas which touch upon the Greek or Roman world, and that are echoed in or adapted by Cicero and Livy. For example, there is no doubt that Polybius figures among the sources of Cicero's De Republica, even though Cicero's adherence to Polybian thought is anything but blind. It has already been noticed, I need only mention just a few names such as Wolbank, Ferrari, Asmis, and Zetzel, that there are important divergences concerning the political representation of the form of government. More specifically, I would like to quote a few words of James Zetzel. Where Polybius has described an immutable order of constitutions at the end of which, in chaos and disaster, the whole cycle would begin again, Scipio, in Cicero's De Republica, believes that any pattern of change is possible. The effect of such remarkable revolutions and almost cycles of changes and alterations is that, contrary to the Polybian pattern, it is not so easy to predict what is going to happen. In this regard, Cicero rejects the inflexibility of Polybius' anakyclosis in order to emphasize the role of the statesman who can control or influence the balance of power in the Respublica. According to Cicero, Roman mixed constitution requires men capable of carrying out their political roles without abusing their position. If such politicians fail their duties, the Roman state will increasingly fail into decline, regardless of the biological sequence of the cycles. Moreover, Cicero compares Lycurgus' constitution with that of Romulus, while Polybius compares it with the Roman mixed constitution, which was established at the collapse of the decemviral government. It means that, as Ferrari pointed out, Cicero prefers to draw a relationship between Romulus and Lycurgus to highlight some clues of mixed constitution as early as the regal period, since, in both cases, the authority of the Senate and Gerusia are taken into account during decision-making. And no doubt this would have been welcome to Cicero, who looked upon the government of one ruler favorably, as long as he is subjected to the authority of the law. Otherwise, the kingship undergoes a progressive degeneration if a ruler, like Tarquinius, behaves tyrannically. As far as Livy is concerned, Polybius is the main source for the events placed in the Greek and Mediterranean world starting from Book 21. Nevertheless, sometimes Livy disassociates himself from his Greek source because of many reasons. For instance, he misunderstands Polybius' language or omits technical and military details that best fit Polybius' pragmatic history, or even prefers to present events in a more favorable light to Roman people and their leaders. In light of this, it is sufficient to say that, on the one hand, Cicero and Livy are indebted to Polybius' political science, but, on the other hand, they rework and adapt it in order to Romanize the contents that Polybius relates from a Greek point of view. Moving on the areas I listed before, in the first one, I will be investigating Polybius' influence on both Cicero and Livy. In the second one, which I can now analyze more briefly, the focus will shift to Livy's adjustments of Polybius' thought. In this case, I refer specifically to my studies on Livy's Ab Urbe Condita Libri, as we can see in the previous slide. But let's start from the first point, leaders versus masses. From Polybius' histories, an ideal type of leader emerges. It does not always correspond to a single hero. However, here we put together every human temperament, which the Greek historian clearly seems to appreciate, we can sketch a fairly definite portrait, as we'll see in the next examples. In terms of virtues, one of the most crucial that leaders, such as generals, statesmen, or kings, should be endowed with is tempering their passions and having a rational behavior towards the masses. As for this antithesis between masses and leaders, it is also common to Solon and Plato. And along these same lines, Polybius makes extensive use of it in his narrative, for example in Book 6, 11, and 21. In particular, let's look at the passage from Book 11 concerning the suppression of a mutiny by Scipio Africanus when his troops were installed at Sucro in Spain, 206 BC. In this passage, Polybius resorts to a simile that is particularly suitable for representing the opposition between the masses and the leader. The former are compared to the sea, the latter to the winds that agitate them. The simile represents a topos in Greek, Solon Herodotus Demosthenes, and Latin literature. In this sense, the influence of Polybius plays an important role, especially regarding the passages taken from Livy. Let's start from Polybius' text. I skipped the Greek to read directly the translation. All translations are taken from the Loeb Classical Library, apart from Livy, translation of Livy, books 21-30. They are taken from the Oxford World Classical series. Polybius. And that is that all multitudes are easily misled and easily impelled to every excess, so that a multitude is ever liable to the same vicissitudes as the sea. For as the sea is by his own nature harmless to those who voyage on it and quiet, but when winds fall violently upon it, seems to those who have dealings with it to be of the same character as the winds that happen to stir it. So, a multitude either appears to be and actually is to those who deal with it of the same character as the leaders and counselors it happens to have. By resorting to a rhetorical device like the simile, Scipio clarifies the nature of the oikos, which is ready to be led or misled on the basis of the behavior of his leader. Livy inherits this figurative image from Polybius, who relates the same episode, touching upon the reaction of Scipio to the mutiny. His text reads, "Like the sea, every crowd is naturally motionless. In you, too, there is the calm or there are tempests, according to the motion produced by the squall and breezes. And the responsibility and cause of your wild behavior lies with the ringleaders. You caught the insanity from them, and it seems to me that not even today are you aware of how far your madness went, of the extent of the outrage you dared to inflict on me, your country, your parents and children, and on the gods who witnessed your oath. You seem unaware of how far you violated the auspices under which you fought, the military traditions and discipline of your forebears, and the majesty of our supreme command." Polybius' version is more neutral than Livy's. The Latin historian is more inclined to a style which results as dramatic and emotionally compelling, so that his Greek source needs to be adapted and enriched. Livy considers the madness of the masses the leitmotif of his text, conveyed by semantic field, which includes terms such as furor, contagio, amentia, insanio. But Polybius does not focus on it, as if there is no room for any kind of justification on the side of both leaders and masses. Furthermore, Livy intends to Romanize Scipio's speech, highlighting that the mutiny was not only harmful to the army and military discipline, but also to Roman customs and values. In fact, the phrases in patriam parentesque ac liberos, in Deos, represent the three main areas where pietas can be exercised, namely politics, family, and religion. In this way, Livy can further intensify the importance of Roman tradition with its concept of value. Following Polybius, Livy also supposes that the behavior of the multitudo reflects that of his leader, in the same way as the condition of the sea depends on whether there are winds or not. But there are still two striking differences. First, Livy attributes to Scipio a more justifiable tone towards rebels and their errors, since they have been infected by the madness of the main troublemakers. Secondly, he does not mention the role of the counselors, which instead Polybius makes explicit. In particular, in Polybius' ideology, it's quite common to come across the role played by counselors who can inspire bad or good behaviors. In this respect, the character of Philip V, king of Macedonia, provides a perfect example, as it has been observed. His way of ruling changes depending on whether he follows the advice of unscrupulous and corrupt men like Demetrius of Pharus, or those of men willing to promote rational and moderate choices, as is the case with Aratus the Elder. In Latin authors, and especially in Livy, the roles of Philip's counselors is completely absent, and his bad governance depends only on the king's behavior, to whom a black portrait is overall attributed. Let's go back to the antithesis leader masses. Arthur Eckstein relates the concept of the masses, which emerges from Scipio's speech, to the general theory of the cycle of constitution, anacuklosis, since the masses, he said, could be an independent and negative force in politics. The masses, indeed, at the beginning of a cycle, establish a democratic government which then degenerates into a chaotic mob rule. In the same way, Polybius disapproves of the demagogic characters who encourage the masses to corruption and loss of control. To give just one example, in Book 2, Gaius Flaminius is described as a corrupter of the people and responsible for the war between Romans and Gauls in 223 BC. So, what is the most desirable solution to overcome the danger of a government of the masses? Polybius believes it lies in the rule of the men who, like Scipio, are able to preserve the order in the army and the state, and to gain the favor of the community without falling into demagoguery. By the same token, the rise of demagogic leaders is condemned without reservation. The description of Molpagoras, leader of a city in Bithynia at the end of 3rd century, is clearly a fitting example. I'll skip the translation to make some remarks just on the text. Molpagoras' portrait summarizes all the typical aspects of a power obtained by means of demagoguery. What is more, it does not hesitate to kill, exile his opponents, or confiscate their property. Consequently, the misfortunes of the city, which will be conquered by Philip V and Prusias of Bithynia, should not arouse compassion, but disdain for the leader's misrule, which bears consequences on the civic body. The situation is comparable to that of the troublemakers of the mutiny of Scipio's troops. If Molpagoras had limited and not indulged the appetite of the masses, just like Scipio, he would have maintained stability. In light of this, also the parallelism with Cicero's thought becomes stronger. John Thornton points out that Polybius and Cicero have in common la radicale sfiducia nella capacità di giudizio razionale delle masse, since they can be easily misguided by demagogues. In the Republica 145, Cicero compares the power of the masses to that of a tyrant, and underlines that only the magnus civis et pene divinus vir can control the state's harmony, like the well-known rector rei publice, protagonist of Book 6 of the Republica. But also in some passages taken from his orations, Cicero shows similar opinions about the temperament of the masses. Procluentio 138 is a case in point. As the sea, though naturally calm, becomes rough and stormy beneath a strong wind, so is it with the Roman people. Peaceable enough, when left to themselves, the speech of a demagogue can rouse them like a furious gale. Despite the different context, yet again we run into the parallelism between the sea and the masses, which can be stirred by the wind and by dangerous seditious men, respectively. Unlike the case with Livy's text, we cannot suppose a direct dependence of Polybius, nor, on the other hand, can we exclude that this motive could be inspired by Cicero's knowledge of Polybius' thought. Fausto Pagnotta has recently highlighted Cicero's use of the metaphor of the sea in a political and ethical context. However, in his study, the mediation of Polybius, as well as the Polybian idea that the masses can be controlled only by thoughtful and balanced leaders, are mentioned just in passing. As already noticed, Polybius plays a crucial role among the sources of the De Republica. In Polybius' footsteps, Cicero describes the nature of the consulship at the beginning of a Roman Republic and strengthens its aristocratic component compared to the people's power. More specifically, the idea that the power of the consuls was regal genere ipso ac iure is taken from a passage of Polybius' book 6, which reads, "If one fixed one's eyes on the power of the consuls, the constitution seemed completely monarchical and royal, so that if one looks at this part of the administration alone, one may reasonably pronounce the constitution to be a pure monarchy or kingship." But one last example regarding the antithesis masses leaders is worth mentioning. Also in Book 21, Polybius considers the image of the sea as particularly appropriate to define the character of the crowd. But this time, he focuses on the relationship between the Romans and the Aetolians, who were at war with each other up to 189 BC. The following passage is taken from the speech attributed to a certain Leon, one of the Athenian ambassadors who arrived in Rome in order to plead the cause of the Aetolians. Here we read, "For what happened in states to the people was very much the same as what befalls the sea. The sea, by its proper nature, was always calm and at rest, and in general of such a character that it would never give trouble to any of those who approach it and make use of it. But when violent winds fall upon it and stir it up, compelling it to move contrary to its own nature, nothing was more terrible and appalling than the sea. And this," he said, "is just what has happened to the Aetholians. As long as no one tampered with them, they were of all the Greeks your most warm and trustworthy supporters. But when Thoas and Lysiarchus, blowing from Asia, and Menestas and Democritus from Europe, stir up the people and compel them, contrary to their nature, to become reckless in word and deed, then, of a truth, in their folly, the Aetolian desired to do you evil, but draw evil on their own ends." Leon's main argument consists in dividing the responsibility between those who are charged with causing the war between Romans and the King Antiochus the Great, they encouraged his presence in Europe, and those who are just misled by the agitator of the masses. Even Livy, in Book 38, draws the same image from Polybius, specifying that it is a vulgata similitudo. And Polybius, in turn, specified that the ambassador resorts to an appropriate example for the present situation, paradigma pros ton paron oikeion. By contrast, Livy is well aware of the topical character of this image, thanks to his rhetorical background. Besides, Cicero had already stressed this simile in the wake of Polybian influences. Here he Livy's text. Using a well-known simile, he, Leon, compared the Aetolian populace to a calm sea whipped up by the winds, and said that when the Aetolians had faithfully adhered to their alliance with Rome, they remained at peace, demonstrating the tranquility natural to them as a people. But when Thoas and Lysiarchus began to blow like winds from Asia and Menestas and Democritus from Europe, the tempest then arose that had driven them onto Antiochus as if onto a reef. Polybius' version is definitely longer than Livy's. If the former prefers to describe first the sea stirred by winds and then, from paragraph 11, to focus on the Aetolians, the latter draws up a more compact narrative in which the term of comparison is immediately explicit. And what is more, he also compares the king of Syria with a rock, adding a climax to a simile. According to Briscoe, Livy abbreviates and adapts, transferring to the Aetolians what Polybius says about the sea's natural calmness, importing into the simile the notion of Antiochus as the rock on which the Aetolians were wrecked. Moreover, Livy shows a measured prejudice towards Rome's enemy. Polybius, in the following paragraph in this chapter 31, states that the multitude of the Aetolians deserves to be forgiven and therefore to come to peace with Rome, while Livy adds nothing else in favor of the Aetolians. This is consistent with the very negative portrait that Livy in general makes of the Aetolians as ungrateful people, despite the benefits they had received by the Romans, unreliable and extremely disposed to anger. However, what is of interest here, apart from all these differences, is that only a positive leader knows how to control the masses and preserve their calmness. In this respect, Scipio represents a kind of reference model, whereas the rebel soldiers and the Aetolians leaders stand for the corresponding generation. Speaking of Scipio's virtues, we can now move on to the second part of this analysis concerning another crucial idea of Polybius' political ideology: how to gain the consent of the vanquished. Several times, Polybius highlights the victor's mildness and mercy in order to gain the consent of the defeated, as Jacqueline de Romilly and John Thornton have pointed out. Having a moderate behavior towards vanquished enemies is opposed to a showing pride and cruelty, which do not provide any benefit in terms of cohesion and long-term political support. For this reason, Polybius praises Philip V's behaviors in 2020, before the war against the Aetolians. In Sparta, during some riots that broke out across the city, a few pro-Macedonian leaders were killed. After that, the Spartans sent an embassy to Philip in order to assure they were not going to open a conflict with him. Among Philip's Philoi, some advised to treat them harshly, in the same way that Alexander the Great had treated the Thebans in 335, and some, like Aratus, suggested a mild reaction. Finally, the king chose to be merciful and spared the Spartans, as Polybius said in Book 4. Considering indeed that his father, after conquering them as enemies, had done them no hurt, it would ill become himself to take extreme vengeance on them for such a trifling fault. Philip refers to Antigonus Doson, that is not his father but his tutor. After defeating the Spartans in the Battle of Sellasia in 222, he decided to have pity on the vanquished, as the ruthlessness shall not be reckoned among the means of hegemony, in order to preserve peace and harmony in international relations. On this issue, also the Book 10 offers a relevant example concerning Scipio's Africanus exploits in Spain in 209-208, and especially his temperance and clemency in favor of the Spaniards. He lets the wife and children of an Iberian chief go free and welcomes Andobales and Mandonius, leaders of the Elergites, as new allies, despite having served alongside the Carthaginians, who instead do not follow an analogous political foresight. I read just the sentence in bold. For after having defeated the Roman forces and killed the two commanders Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, they regarded their position in Spain, the Carthaginians, as undisputed and treated the native in an overbearing manner. In consequence, their subjects, instead of being their allies and friends, were their enemies. From Polybius' viewpoint, the Carthaginians are an anti-model, since they lead the vanquished peoples to seek new alliances. The contraposition masses versus leaders is emphasized again, insofar as the former is influenced by the latter's choices. If the ruler behaves with moderation, the success achieved on a military level can be strengthened on the political one. In this regard, the Romans, and Scipio Africanus in particular, represent a relevant example. Let's focus on the last passages when Scipio is hailed as king by some Iberian peoples. It is interesting to compare Polybius' narrative to Livy's and to observe how his political lessons are reworked by the Latin historian. I think I don't have time to read the entire passages, so I will focus just a few points. The Iberian, start from Polybius, the Iberians in the districts I spoke of, who were still allies of the Carthaginians, now came in to submit to the Romans, and on meeting Scipio, saluted him as king. When after the battle all addressed him as king, the matter gave him pause. He therefore assembled the Iberians and told them that he wished to be called kingly by them, and actually to be kingly, but that he did not wish to be king or to be called so by anyone. After saying this, he ordered them to call him general. And then Livy. A crowd of Spaniards began to swarm around him, men who had surrendered earlier as well as those taken prisoner the day before, and they, of one accord, held him as their king. Scipio thereupon had silence proclaimed by a herald. The greatest name for him, he declared, was the one with which his own soldier had held him, general. The title of king, which is a great prestige as were, he explained, was anathema in Rome. As for his having the spirit of a king, that was for them to judge in silence, but they should avoid the use of the word. Livy agrees with Polybius in showing the success of Scipio's strategy on the political and diplomatic levels, but diverges from him in representing Scipio's reaction to the attitude of the Spaniards. First, Livy specifies that the Spaniards acclaim Scipio as king only in this passage, while Polybius adds two more circumstances. Here at 1014, before this battle is called Battle of Baecula, and at 1038, but just in passing. Livy, therefore, does not hesitate to rework his source, to omit inconvenient details which would call into question the good name of Rome, and to add some elements which Romanize his narrative. But the most striking is the sentence Regium nomen alibi magnum Rome intolerabile esse. It is completely absent in Polybius' version and reflects the historian's prudence in dealing with the royalty question. Livy's attitude is in fact consistent with the Latin conception of odium regni, which is crucial to the Roman value system. Be that as may, Scipio refused to be praised with this dangerous appellation and preferred to be called Imperator Strategos. The refusal of this title does not imply that Scipio has no royal soul. Livy diverges from Polybius on this point too. Scipio, in Polybius' text, while rejecting the claim of king, admits that he is basilikos. By contrast, in Livy's version, not only does he refuse to be called king, but he even rejects the attribution of the royal soul in public context. In Polybius' passage, as Fabrizio Ferraco rightly observes, following Andrea Aimar, si riflette il greco di epoca ellenistica, che concepisce l'idea di un animo regale slegato dall'ambizione politica. Consequently, on the basis of Polybius, it has been supposed that the Iberians did not consider Scipio king of Rome or king of Spain, but Basileus, by the Hellenistic meaning of a man endowed with the highest military and moral qualities. So, Livy seems much more interested in the resonance that the title of king could have among the Romans than in the title itself, unlike Polybius, who focuses on a theoretical idea of the kingship and does not emphasize the political implications related to this dangerous title. As a result, in the Greek text, Scipio's refusal is more justified in the background of moral reasons, namely the continence and the magnanimity of the leader. Instead, in the Latin text, Livy highlights the political reasons connected to Scipio's choice. He was in fact aware that Iberians and Romans had a very different perception of being king. So, in conclusion, Cicero's judgment of Polybius as peritissimum rerum civilium is especially fitting to all the cases that we have touched upon. Within the narrative flow of his pragmatic history, Polybius inserts real precepts of political conduct which are useful for those who hold on to the reins of power, kings, magistrates, generals. As the previous examples have shown, two elements are quite common: the contraposition between leaders and masses, with a negative perception of the demagogical leaders and the masses as political force, and the importance of hegemony which aims at a consensus of vanquished peoples, avoiding ruthless repressive methods as much as possible. In this sense, the influence of Polybius on Cicero and Livy represent a good starting point to undertake an in-depth analysis of how Polybius's political lessons flow into Latin works and on to what extent they are reworked. Cicero and Livy do not simply adopt Polybius's political lessons in their works. Far from being passive, they often romanize Polybius's narrative. This is, in fact, an historian who, despite being a great expert of Roman custom and traditions, tells the past from a Greek perspective, with a detachment that we cannot obviously find in Cicero and Livy. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank also Elisa for speech, and I ask her to let her place to Federica, because in this way we can please take your questions for the end of the session, and so we can have questions for both together. And I begin to introduce Federica Lazzarini, who studied with me in Turin about Varro. It is strange to fall in love with Varro, but she's one people who fell in love with Varro from as a child, and she remained in love with Varro even during her PhD in Oxford, and now she's preparing a book by Oxford University Press about Varro, and she's speaking on Varro and Cicero. The title is Conceptualizing Collective Identities in Cicero and Varro. So I can...
I also have a USB. I don't know where to put it.
This one?
No, I haven't put it back. So.
Okay.
And
there is no place to add. Okay.
Oh, right.
Presentation.
No, la PowerPoint. È quella sotto.
PDF? No, questo è un PDF.
Devo manovrarlo?
Sì, mi metto.
Sì, scusi. Oh, grazie mille. Okay, let me check that the presentation mode works or not. Nope. Then I will use this presentation and notes. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers. This really interesting conference. I know I'm the last one. I'll do my best to make it interesting. So in this paper, I want to focus on one particular aspect that is actually involved in the design and dissemination of any work of political science. That is how we conceptualize and talk about a community. All discussions of political philosophy operate within the frame of a certain conception of a collective identity. Also, I should say, everything I'm projecting here is also on your handout, so I might be going quickly over some slides, but if you want to look at them in your conveniences, you have them. So in social psychology, a collective identity is defined as one that is shared with others who have or are believed to have some characteristics in common. And this commonality and one's positioning within it is psychological in nature, because the identification with a certain category depends on the individual's claim or acceptance of that category membership as part of their identity. We talked this morning about koinonia in Aristotle. That is, of course, one type of collective identity. This topic is also investigated in cultural anthropology, which puts more emphasis on the fact that collective identities are made up of purely symbolic elements. A collective identity is the image that a group has of itself and with which its members associate themselves. So it doesn't exist as a tangible, concrete reality. It is a metaphor, a social construct. It's made up of purely symbolic elements. And for this reason, talking about collective identity also requires a resorting to abstraction. And authors, past and present, who talk about collective identities usually resort to metaphors or models. We've seen metaphors in this conference. We talked about the botanical metaphor in Silvia Castaldi's paper, and now the saw metaphor in Elisa's paper. And conceptual metaphor theory teaches us that, well, shows that actually, that depending on the kind of metaphor that we use, well, the metaphors that we use provide us with the conceptual framework that shapes and helps us to convey certain ideas, making certain aspects emerge and not others. And I mean, I just quoted a few examples here, but we might quote many more. And one thing that I also want to talk about are models of collective identity. And by that I mean abstract representations or visualizations that convey, that illustrate how a collective identity comes to be and what the relationship between its members are. So I'm going to very briefly touch on some models of collective identity before homing in on the two authors that I want to talk about in this talk, that is Cicero and Varro. So bear in mind that I'm not going to get into the specifics of the actual contents of these theories. I am aware that I'm in a room full of experts on Plato and Aristotle. I'm only touching on the abstract representations of what the community is like, what it's made of. So, for example, Plato represents in the Republic, represents the polis as a uniform entity, a mia polis, where the individual is entirely absorbed within the community. And in fact, they are encouraged to identify with the community. In fact, Socrates begins his investigation of justice within the community with the purpose of investigating justice within the human being. So the polis is presented as a projection of the individual onto a bigger scale. In fact, the social classes are made to match with parts of the human soul within a human being. So in this model, the individual is essentially nullified. The strength of the polis depends on its being one, to mian einai, and plurality is the greatest threat to the stability of the polis. By contrast, in Aristotle's political essays, it is maintained that plurality, both in the sense of numerosity and diversity, is it's actually the intrinsic nature of the state. And instead of representing the state as one uniform entity, Aristotle stresses that it's in fact a mosaic entity. It's the outcome of a conglomeration of smaller and smaller associations, which do retain their own individual traits. And that is actually what the stability of the community depends on. So this is a tessellation rather than a uniform entity. These two models were my own attempt to represent visually the theories of Plato and Aristotle. But by contrast, the Stoic theory of oikeiosis is represented with this model already in the texts themselves. Oikeiosis is often translated as appropriation. It is the process by which the individual extends their idea of home from the self to the family to ultimately the entire cosmos. And already in the text, it is represented as concentric circles. So, like in Plato, here, the community is essentially a bigger scale projection of the individual. But unlike in Plato, the individual is not absorbed within the community. They are literally centered. And the individual recognizes the items of each circle, well, the beings of each circle as their kin, therefore appropriates them, and quite literally draws them into their circles. So actually here, the individual builds their community around them. So hopefully now we have a clearer idea of what I mean when I talk about models of collective identity. I want to bring the attention now to the two authors that I want to talk about, that is Cicero and Varro, both authors writing in the late Roman Republic, which is an interesting period to talk about how people thought of themselves as a community, because it was notoriously a time of crises for a couple of reasons. a few events that happened within the space of one generation. Rome had been engaged in the social war with her former Italian allies, and after the social war, Roman citizenship was extended to all the Italian peoples, transforming deeply the very fabric of the Roman society. At the same time, roughly at the same time, war was being waged against other peoples perceived as barbarian, whom Caesar wanted to bring under the rule of Rome. And then there was conflict within the Republic itself at various levels. And then we had individual politicians defying the institutions that had always been what held the state together and basically doing what they wanted. So all of these events shook the foundation and stability of the Roman state as it had been. And the notions of community and indeed Roman identity underwent important scrutiny, as well as the concept itself of citizenship. What did it mean to be a Roman citizen when, first of all, this was no longer a privilege of the Latins because it had been extended to all the Italian peoples. And second, this bond didn't stop Roman citizens from murdering each other, both every day in the street and in not one but multiple civil wars. So we see authors in this period discussing and wondering about what kept them together. Perhaps no one more preeminently than Cicero. So let's begin with the Repubblica. This is the definition of a republic that he puts in the mouth of the character Scipio. A republic is the property of the public. And we will come back later to this understanding of res publica, res populi. But a populus is not every kind of human gathering congregating in any manner, but a numerous gathering brought together by legal consent and community of interest. Cicero says that people have a natural compulsion to congregare, which literally means to herd together, like sheep. And this is lexicon, that it's vocabulary that reminds us of Aristotle's vocabulary, who says that human beings are by nature agelaioi, and also Polybius, who says that humans have a natural compulsion to synagelazesai, which is literally the equivalent of congregari. But in order for a gathering to qualify as a populus, it must be kept together by a binding force. And this bond is based on community of interest, utilitatis communio, and juris consensus, that is an agreement on use, where use implies not just laws, but also rights and values. Community of interest was already present in Aristotle's theory, and it was also at the center of European political philosophy, which focused on and emphasized asphaleia, security, as the key motive for humans to gather in communities. But by contrast, juris consensus seems to be Ciceronian novelty. And it brings to mind the concept of justitia connectiva, which is something that cultural anthropologists talk about as central in ancient civilizations, I should say. The basic tenet that good and bad behavior will be requited accordingly is what used to keep societies together in a spirit of solidarity and reciprocity. Use as a binding force emerges also from another work of Cicero, that is the Legibus. This passage in particular is always quoted and commented on in all studies that deal with the relationship between Rome and the Italian peoples in the 1st century BCE, because it provides an interesting model, an idea on how different layers of identities might coexist. So Cicero is talking about people who live in the municipia, in small towns, that is, cities that have Roman citizenship after the social war, but are not the city of Rome itself. And he says that these people, so Roman citizens not from Rome, have two countries, one by nature and the other by citizenship. For example, Cato, being born in Tusculum but being a Roman citizen, was a Tusculan by birth and a Roman by citizenship. One of his countries was local, the other legal. We think of our country both as our place of birth and as the one which admitted us to citizenship, but the one which takes its name from the state as a whole, the Universa Respublica, Universa Civitas, should have first place in our affection. So we should put the Republic first in our affection, but it is normal for us to be attached to our place of birth, even though the other country is greater and includes this within it. This piece of theory employs descriptive language that creates a visual model for the readers, which we might represent like this. The Universa Civitas is literally a greater container of smaller homelands to which sectors of the populace are attached as their place of birth. However, this model is different both from the one underlying Aristotle's theory and the one of Oikeus's of concentric circles. And it's different for the same reason, I think. The res publica here is not exactly the sum of its parts. It's not the result of a sum of all the different municipia. It is something intangible. On the one hand, it's a legal status, and on the other hand, it's an identity. So Cicero is appealing to two different dimensions of the concept of civitas. So it's not the outcome of the smaller associations, but it's something that permeates all affinities that an individual might feel. Now, I'm going to set Cicero aside for a moment and introduce the other author that I want to talk about, that is Varro. And one might legitimately wonder whether Varro even belongs in a conference like this one, since, as far as we know, he never wrote a book of political philosophy. And that's true, but he wrote other writings which have, on different subjects, which have political implications. For example, the Res Rusticae, which on the face of it is a treatise on agronomy. First of all, though, what is innovative is that it's not a treatise on agriculture and animal husbandry in Rome, but it brings the focus on the entire territory under Roman rule, including Italia and the provinces. And I should clarify, when we talk about ancient Italia, that doesn't really coincide with the entire Italian peninsula nowadays. Actually, at this point in time, authors diverged on they have different reports of what Italia exactly consists of. Varro's own conception of what counts as Italia sort of corresponds with what I have enclosed in orange in this map, and it's already one of the most inclusive ones at this point in time. Now, in recent years, this treatise has been reappraised as something more than a treatise on agronomy. It has been read as a satirical book, and in particular, Grant Nelson-Stewin has read it as a geopolitical book, which, by rationalizing the agronomical management of the territory under the control of Rome, crafts a rudimentary political philosophy that attempts to account for the imperial realities of the Roman state. So in this book, Varro comes up with a novel conception of the Roman imperium as colonial. The imperium is framed as an estate, a fundus, composed of three distinct areas, the city, Italy, and the provinces, that are unified under and structured by the metaphor of one property. So to give an example of one passage from which we can glean some political and geopolitical implications, this is a passage where Varro discusses the polysemy of the word terra, which was just as polysemic in Latin as it is in modern languages. He says terra is used with three senses: common, proper, and mixed. In the common sense, we say terra when we say the world or the earth, orbis terrae, or the land of Italia, terra Italia. Then sometimes we say terra with its proper name, and it just means land generically. Or sometimes we say terra mixta, and that is the terra in which something can be sown and grow. So in this sense, terra just means soil, which varies a lot from one territory to another. It can be abounding in clay, rocky, and so on, because in this terra, there are as many forms as in the common one because of the mixtures. Now, Varro's prose is not as clear and lucid as Cicero. It takes a few readings sometimes to really get the point that he's making. But if we look at this passage carefully, we'll see that actually Varro is crafting a model of a collective identity. According to this understanding, both Italia and, on a greater scale, the universe, because he says orbis terrae, are construed as terrae communes. There are corporate entities with a unified quality, whereas the diverse territories that make them up have terrae mixtae, which vary considerably from ager to ager. According to Nelson-Stewin's reading, this approach construes Italia on the one hand as an entity that incorporates smaller regions, and on the other hand as a corporate identity that marks itself off in contradistinction to other terrae, so that something that has its own identity even as a corporate identity. As such, Italia is not merely the sum of its parts, of its different agri, but it's something that still retains a corporate identity unified under the Empire of Rome. Now, this seems to me like a variation of Cicero's model of the two homelands, with two key differences. One is that both Cicero's discussion of government in the Repubblica and his model of the two homelands in De Legibus pivot around the city, the urbs and the municipia, whereas Varro brings the focus onto the entire territory under the rule of Rome, with an imperial perspective. And the second difference is that in Varro's model, not only, as I said, not only the smaller parts of the have strong territorial connotations, but also the corporate identity. Unlike Cicero's Patria Civitatis, which had more of a cultural and psychological grounding. Varro's Italia, instead, as a collective identity, has clearly demarcated boundaries which set it apart from other communities, that is, those that exist outside of the borders of Italia. And an allusion to the outside border has been detected also in another passage from which we can glean some geopolitical bits of political philosophy. That is, after he's talked about what exactly Italia, what lands are included into Italia, he said, is Italia not planted with trees such that altogether it looks like an orchard? Pomarium. Now, before writing this kind of books, Varro used to write satires. He likes puns, and he uses them all the time. So it has been suggested that there's a wordplay here between pomarium and pomerium, that is, the border enclosing the territory surrounding a state. Thank you. Another Varronian writing that has that hides some bits of political philosophy is the Latin language. Again, a treatise on the Latin language, but in 5 minuti? 10, penso che sia. Which was written at a time when grammar was still a discipline in the making, and so sometimes he has to come up with visual language and metaphorical language in order to convey certain ideas. So, for example, an idea that comes up again and again through the lingua latina is that of affinity or community. And it's something that exists at all levels of the linguistic analysis, but he expresses this concept through visual imagery that can be narrowed down to 2 metaphors, the family and the tree. For example, words sharing a lexical base are compared to twin siblings born from the same parents. Inflected forms of that declension are compared to children of the same family. And then he makes frequent use of botanical vocabulary. He talks about roots, seeds, and stalks and fruits. Now, these metaphors overlap to an extent because just like happens in modern languages, familial vocabulary and botanical vocabulary also shares a lot of vocabulary. We talk about family trees and roots and seeds, etc. And this has been studied in conceptual metaphor theory, but I propose that we consider the family tree as a model for collective identity. What might that imply? A tree is an organism made up by jointed parts with bifurcating conformation that can be replicated further, because the trunk splits into many roots and branches, and each offshoot can split further into other roots or branches or leaves or fruits. So a tree effectively conveys the idea of different entities which can grow very apart from each other, but are ultimately connected to the same core, much like the terrae mixtae that belong together within the same terra communis. So this configuration actually combines 2 different ways of talking about kinship, one which stresses the unity and a centripetal attraction of things towards the center, and one which stresses the multiplicity and a centrifugal movement of things towards the outside. So I'm wondering what I can cut, actually, because I had everything to fit into 30 minutes, but if I need to keep it shorter, what can I cut?
You cannot.
I might struggle. Okay. So I'm going to then skip this part. This was just, you have it on your handout if you're interested, or we can go back to that in question time just to see how this metaphor applies at the level of language contact. And just to say that by comparing languages and words to something which have roots that creeps into different fields, where the fields are metaphorically languages, Varro provides, actually conveys the concept of language and the words being connected at a deep level, actually deeper than mutual borrowing of words, which actually was unprecedented in antiquity. So again, this is a model for a collective entity, in this case the Latin lexicon, which accounts for diversity while securing unity. I have one final section of my paper in which I would like to situate these models for collective identity that we've seen against the background of Rome's juridical culture, to show how Roman juridical culture informs and provides the conceptual framework for both Cicero's and Varro's conceptions of collective identity. For Cicero's constitutionalism, this has been defended by Michael Schofield in a seminal paper from 1995. Now we go back to that definition of the res publica as a res populi. According to Schofield, this proposition is to be intended as expressing ownership, so populi would be a genitive of possession. So the state is a property of the populus, not in the sense of literal property, but of owning rights over the management and use of the affairs of the state and having the liberty to express those rights. But if people are the owners of the res publica, then how can we justify having a government? So Cicero is posing the question of the problem of legitimacy of government, which again Schofield argues was unprecedented in ancient political thought. And to answer this question, he appeals to the institution of guardianship, tutela. A form of government that consults the interests of the people is legitimate because the power of the people, that is the rights to manage and use the affairs of the state, is not transferred to the government, but merely entrusted to it. And to express this concept, Cicero uses specific Roman vocabulary, such as tutela, secum mittere, and fides. So this legitimacy of government is ensured by the conceptual framework of Roman law. And my suggestion is that Varro's theory of kinship and community also operates within the conceptual framework of Roman law. So let's reflect again on the family tree metaphor and model for collective identity. First of all, it seems relevant to point out that in ancient Italy, trees were commonly used as points of reference for boundary marking. So using the tree as a metaphor for a community immediately evokes the concept of property, because a tree was literally what drew the line between what was mine and what was someone else's. Secondly, since we're talking about family, our modern sensitivity might associate family with something like community, vicinity, and affection. But if we assume that Varro was working within the framework of Roman law, then in that framework, family defines the jurisdiction within which the authority of the paterfamilias can be exercised. So if that is true, then family in that framework is first and foremost something that has to do with property. It is specifically the rights that the paterfamiliar has over the things and the people of his household. And reading the family tree metaphor through this lens has intriguing consequences when we see this metaphor applied to the relationship between Latin and other languages. And firstly, we should ask the question, can language be considered a property? For Cicero, I would say yes, because when he says that the res publica is a res populi, presumably the res publica is not just actual concrete property, but it defines also culture and institution, and that should include language. For Varro, it's more difficult to say, but there are some parts in the Lingua Latina which suggest so. He talks about Latin as a compound language made up of different languages. And all of Varro's words so when he talks about native and foreign words, he uses words like nostra, dominata, or vernacula for native words, and aliena, adventicia, and peregrina for foreign words. The fact that we use a similar terminology nowadays to talk about native and foreign words, so it comes natural to us, it shouldn't obscure the fact that this wasn't a given. There are other semantic fields which could have sourced metaphorical language to that effect. So it wasn't a given to resort to familiar language, and it merits reflection. All of Varro's words to indicate native words evoke membership within a familia. We have nostra, and we should say the possessive was the most ancient legal formula codified in the 12 tables to claim ownership of a thing. You would go to court and say, this thing is mine. And that was the legal formula to claim ownership. What was born at home was immediately subject to the patria potestas, and vernaculus comes from verna, which means a slave born in his master's house. As for foreign words, adventicius and peregrinus evoke the physical movement from one place to another, but alienus in particular is interesting as a direct counterpart of nostra, because it literally means property of someone else. And nothus, that is a Hellenism, the figurative meaning is hybrid or mixed, but literally it means bastard. Yep. So again, familial vocabulary. So I would say that yes, for Varro too, language can be considered a property. That prompts the further and final question, that is, if owning a word entails having rights over it, then does this possession transfer to the thing called by that word? Because in that case, when Varro talks about kinship between Latin and other languages, that might have some interesting geopolitical implication when it comes to the relationship between Rome and Italian peoples and their things and their culture. Again, some passages in the Lingua Latina seem to confirm this parallel between ownership of the word and ownership of the thing. In this passage, which I'm not going to read out, the dispute about the origin of the names Tiberis and Volturnus is solved by claims of ownership over the rivers themselves and things related. Volturnum is a city of ours, a colony of ours. Tiberinus is a Roman god. Therefore, we have the right to claim Tiberis and Volturnum as Roman Latin words. So to summarize, my suggestion is that Varro's particular way of describing the kinship between Latin and other languages casts Latin as the head of a familia, granting it rights to claim as its own, use, and govern the words belonging to it. And I also suggest that this thesis is directly reflected onto the relationship between the people that speak Latin, the Romans, and things belonging to other peoples, be they places, objects, or cultural heritage, which Rome may claim as her own, use, and govern. And this is also in line with the presentation in the Res Rusticae of the Roman dominion as an estate and Rome as its manager. So to draw conclusions on Cicero's and Varro's conceptions of community, what we can notice is that both of their visions of community have a broader horizon than the city of Rome and take into account the different political realities, ethnicities, and cultures coexisting in Italy in the 1st century BCE. But they both acknowledge the difference and variety that distinguishes the many realities that lived within it under Roman rule. In particular, Varro's tree metaphor, configuration, emphasizes how much the members of a collective identity can diverge from one another. And they both reckon with this plurality by appealing to a greater unifying entity. But whereas Cicero appeals to civitas in its legal, psychological, and identity dimensions, Varro refers to Italia as a concrete entity grounded in the territory and history of Rome. And finally, both of their political philosophies operate within the framework of Roman law, and they both conceived of community in terms of property and ownership of and rights over things and culture that can be acquired, transferred, and entrusted to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I ask Elisa to come here, and I assure you that Federica is able to speak Italian quite so good as she speaks English. Please, so questions for both or for Elisa first? Elisa is suffering conjunctivitis, and so for her it has been very difficult to read, but I thank you also for this, because it has been an endeavor to do that. So please, if there are questions.
I have a question for Federica.
Okay, you have a question for Federica, but if there are before questions about Livy and Polybius. Please.
Thank you very much for the paper. I have a question about oikeiosis. Oikeiosis and the Stoic connection, is possible similitude with Hierocles, Stoic, with the finibus and the expansion for the circle, the I, the humanity, and what is the animals? It's the limit of the oikeiosis, the familiarity or the appropriation. With Cicero, this is a rational conception of sociability. What is your think about the oikeiosis, specific Ciceronian term?
I'm not sure. I didn't hear everything. I'm not sure I understand the question.
The microphone does not work properly. So it's not so easy to...
I heard about the rational... It might just be me, sorry.
This is only for the oikeiosis term in the application in the Caesarean context and the Stoic influence are similarly of the Hierocles Stoicus.
Mhm.
Count the
A.
similitude
O.
Yeah, I hear. So, okay. Hierocles, yes, he's the source for oikeiosis, for the model. Yeah.
Yes. No, my question is about oikeiosis in Cicero.
Oh,
the
okay.
finibus on int 3 in the what is the similitude with the Hierocles conception and the Stoic
Absolutely.
oikeiosis conception?
Yes. Thank you. No, absolutely. I had to leave that part out, but of course, yes, Cicero does talk about oikeiosis in the finibus. However, the reason why I didn't make a point about that is that from what I can see, he doesn't fundamentally alter the model of oikeiosis as it is. I'm not saying that he has nothing new to say about oikeiosis, so Ciceronians don't come at me. Obviously, he has innovations to propose. Also, there's some interesting things to say about how he Romanizes the language, which is something that Carlos Levi has commented on. He uses vocabulary like conciliari and se committere, so he uses language that has to do with the Roman relationships and actually the etiquette of the time. So he does make alterations to the concept of citizenship, of oikeiosis and the theory itself. But from what I can see, he might, as Carlos Levi put it, reverse the model in that it starts from the outside, from the cosmos, and he says, il romanise la nature. So he brings nature on to fit man. But from what I can tell, that doesn't fundamentally revise this model. Maybe he's just considering it from the outside in instead of from the inside out. So just in terms of abstract models, it doesn't really strike me as something completely different. Although the theory itself, yes, he enriches it and also blends it in with his own academic background for sure.
Elisa, if you have your question for...
Yes, it's just a curiosity. I was interested in various use of terra.
Yep.
And Cicero, and also Livy, but Cicero first, use terra, of the idea of terra, as opposed to urbs or civitas, because it's, for example, Cicero talked about Capua, that was completely destroyed, and the Roma lived just terra. And as a terra without political institutions. And I was wondering if does terra also have a sort of negative meaning in Varro from a ethical point of view, or is just my idea?
Okay. Thank you so much. I'll have to ask you the reference for the reference later. I don't think that it has a negative point of view. I think. But it might very well be that Varro is aware of this passage when he's writing that, because we often see him answering directly to Ciceronian points, or at least that's my own interpretation. But so it might be. But with a passage like this one, he's actually trying to make a distinction. Not all terrae are the same. So perhaps this terra mixta, that would be what Cicero talks about with a negative connotation. That is something that is, it's just soil. But he's showing that terra has other meanings, and the other meanings of terra, I don't think we can say are negative. So he often does this thing. Instead of coming up with new terms, he takes a term that has a lot of meanings and then adds some specifications. So it is a bit frustrating to reckon with his terminology. But so I think not in general, it's not all negative, but some connotations might be.
Just land to cultivate and that's it. And
quite likely. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. I would have a small comment on Frederick just mentioned. Microphone. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. My comment concerns Cicero opposition in book 1 of the Republica between human gathering and legal consent. You seem to me to connect this human gathering with Aristotelian agele, so concept of agele. In fact, in Aristotle you have both. You have agele on one hand, so you have zoa, which are agelaia, and at the same time you have Zoa, which are politica. And it's very interesting that obviously for humans you can use both of them, in the sense that politica is a cultivated form of agelaia. And you have even something very similar in Plato, namely in Politicus, in the Statesman, where the stranger distinguishes between agelaiotrophia and koinotrophia and agelaiotrophia, something like this. So either you gather people or humans as herds, or you treat them as a koinonia or zoa which live in koinonia. And it seems to be that in both cases, in Aristotle and in Plato, this other part, opposed to agelaia, are connected to legal considerations. It's connected with nomos and with politeia. So it's very similar, I would say.
Thank you. Is this in the politics or in the laws?
No, it's in Historia Animalium, first book.
Oh, right. No. You also mentioned Plato.
Sorry, and Plato is statesman.
Oh, right, statesman. Okay. Yeah, I did not include the statesman into this, but thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all sympathetic to the view that Cicero might have read Plato for sure. We don't know about Aristotle, but these ideas would have filtered through him for sure. Thank you.
Please.
I have a question for each one, but both the speakers. Starting with Professor Della Calce. At the end of your presentation, you spoke about the royal figure or royal aspects of Scipio. Really?
Yes.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In Polybius' description. My question is, could it be possible that in that page there were a memory of a particular type of monarch proceeding from the Aristotelian politics? Because in book 3, once again, this fatal book 3 of politics, in the second part, chapter 14, Aristotle lists a fourth category of monarchy, depending from very ancient archaic profiles. And one of them is the chief of the army, the military leader, who has not the title of king, of course, but acts and its worth of honor like a king.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there is a certain similarity,
yes.
But it would be possible, in your opinion, an allusion or a memory of this Aristotelian category of archaic monarchy?
Yes, absolutely. Because Polybius had a knowledge of Plato and Aristotle, of course. Maybe it's not a direct knowledge. We suppose also mediation. For example, from the Arc of Messana, who writes a Tripolitikos, this is a pupil of Aristotle. And also in the Polybian work flows of the Stoic elements, and a mixture of memories, and we have Plato, Aristotle, and Stoics, and also the social context. It was Scipio Emilianus and Panetius, so it could be an allusion or a cultural memory about this passage. And by contrast, Livy is clearer compared to Polybius about the odium regni. This is the priority for Livy to underline that Scipio can be called king, and he can have also a royal soul, at least a public. And thank you.
Thank you. And the other question for Professor Lazzarini. Very interesting, exciting, the definition by Varro of Italia as pomarium. My question is double. From one end, there is in the Varro manuscript tradition a variation in the manuscripts with this lectio, and then what about the diffusion of the text of Varro during the centuries 13 and 14th? Because in chapter 6 of Purgatory, Dante calls Italy the garden of the empire. And the garden of empire is a paraphrasis of the word pomarium, evidently, but with the ambiguity at the same time with pomerium, is reproaching the fact that German emperors have abandoned the Italian territory to the disputes of municipia and local political institutions. So, with a direct apostrophe to Rudolf and Albert I, he asks, what have you done for your will of richness, so that you have abandoned completely the garden of the empire? Che avete tu e il tuo padre sofferto per cupidigia di costadi stretti, che il giardin dello imperio sia deserto. And commentators quote the variation, the ambiguity between pomarium and pomerium, because we don't know which could be the source of Dante. But of course, after reading this quotation by Varro, I think that it's quite probably that the very origin of this quite famous Dante's definition of Italy is the lingua Latina. But what about the diffusion of at that age? Because Dante's commentators at the end of the 14th century quite often quote Varro as auctoritas for etymologies and grammatical questions. But I don't know if Dante had access to this text.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. That is fantastic, and I had no idea. So, first of all, in terms of the variants in the manuscript, I don't know because I have not seen the manuscript. But also, this is not my suggestion that there's a pun here. It has been made by Nelson Stewart and someone before him. I think Roche, but I could be wrong. So I would imagine that before making this suggestion, they would have made sure that there wasn't a variant. As for your suggestion, I am really, really interesting and intriguing. I don't know whether Dante would have read Varro, but I know that Petrarca did, and because Petrarca's is the famous definition of Varro as il terzo gran lume romano. So, given this context and time and historical context, yes, and also cultural context, it would not be surprising, perhaps, if Petrarca was so well acquainted and had such high praises for Varro that Dante would have known him. Also, if you say that his commentators do quote him, then perhaps, yes, his work must have been known. Again, I don't know how many of his works were known in the Middle Ages, but Petrarca must have known him well enough to feel confident enough to make that statement. So I don't know whether that is in fact the source, but it doesn't seem impossible from given all these considerations. So thank you.
We should check the spreading of the manuscripts, of Varro's manuscripts in this age, and I cannot say, I cannot help. It could be, it could also not be, because for the Lingua Latina, we have only one manuscript, which is much later, and so humanistic script. So, but the tradition of res rusticae, you know, it was with Cato and with Palladio all together in only one tradition.
I was thinking on the encyclopedic tradition, anthologies, collection, paraphrases. Maybe there is a mediation of this kind, and not a direct quotation from the
more simply, simpler one, it could be also to think to the Laudes Italiae in Virgil, if there is something like a garden of Italy. I don't remember, but it could be also be there. This is a text that Dante's certainly he knew it par cœur.
Yes, it could be. The mediation could be the Virgilian tradition, exegetical commentary. Yes.
And
maybe
to that point,
Servio, we should check it.
And to that point, Varro is actually the first, according to Nelson students, the first Laus Italiae of this kind. So everything that comes after that is more famous actually came after this one. So.
Please, the microphone should be moved.
So thank you very much, Federica. It's not actually a question, but just a remark, because we were talking about congregari so long, and later on in Cicero, congregari is the terminus technicus for social occasions in De Finibus and De Offici, and he might already have it in mind when writing De Republica. So it gives, perhaps it makes your argument stronger, I think.
Oh, thank you. No, absolutely. I do not remember this one too. I remember secum mitere and what was the other one? Commendari. But yeah, it definitely it seems very plausible. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, we can say that also this panel is finished. We thank once again both orators